us in person.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
That's one of the things we need to test out.
Okay. But if you would particularly identify yourself for those who are not physically present in the room, that would be very helpful. So let's run around the room, and given how busy things are to my right, we'll go opposite direction. Yeah. Julie, if you'd start.
Julie Nash from the FCC's Office of Engineering and Technology.
Dale Hatfield, University of Colorado.
Henning Schultzweni, Office of Strategic Planning, FCC.
Mark Rocher, ATSC.
Kevin Sparks, Lucent.
Mike McNamara, TW Telecom, representing Harold Teets from TW Telecom.
John Chapin, DARPA, serving in individual capacity here today.
Len Claudy, National Association of Broadcasters.
Peter Bloom, General Atlantic Partners. Pete Cronus, representing Earthlink.
Pierre Dupree, Silicon Flatiron Center.
Dick Green, Liberty Global.
Teresa Hennessy, Comcast.
Mark Garnberg, I'm a venture capitalist in San Francisco.
Marvin Serbu, special government employee.
Lynn Merrill here representing NTCA.
Tom McGarry with Newstar, sitting in for Mark Bregman.
Ed Chen from Verizon. Brian Markwalter with the Consumer Electronics Association.
Brian Fonts, National Emergency Number Association.
Thank you. Paul Meisner at Amazon.com, a newbie to the group, but not quite to the building.
Hi, Glenn Tyndall, Juniper Networks.
Ramani Pandragan, XL Communications.
Jesse Russell, Inc. Network, small cell technology company.
Mark Bayless from Visual Inc.
Patrick Halley with the FCC.
Greg Lappin, American Radio Relay League.
Kevin Kahn, Intel.
David Tenenhouse, Microsoft.
Nomi Bergman, Bright House Networks.
Russell Jurek, Cisco.
John Barnhill with Jen Band, sitting in for Fred Kemmerer, Jen Band's new representative on the TAC.
Michael Ha, OET FCC.
Okay, Walter Johnston, OET, and we're determining how many engineers it takes to run a presentation. We're up to 2.
Oh, no, you had a couple others, don't you? And now, do we have access to those on the phone?
Well, yeah, Marty Cooper's on.
Jeff Mendenhall, Harris Broadcast.
Could you repeat yourself, the last person?
Jeff Mendenhall, Harris Broadcast.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
And Vish Nandlal, Ericsson.
Adam Jack Waters, Level 3.
Fred Kemmer, Gen Band. I'm new to the group.
Hi, this is Jack Michalski from Qualcomm.
Hi, this is Jack Waters from Level 3.
Hi, this is Brian Daly, AT&T.
Hi, this is George Popovich, Motorola Solutions, representing Paul Steinberg.
Anyone else?
I assume you heard me with Marty on the phone?
I sure did, Marty. You were loud and clear.
Sorry.
Sort of like that first cell phone call.
Great.
Now, we have a large group on the call this time, so we're going to have to operate a little differently as well to make sure that we do allow for the interaction with those on the phone. So please, those on the phone, mute yourself when you're not speaking, but when you are speaking, jump in as you will with the conversation going on. And I know there's a little bit of a challenge because the video side of the streaming video is a little delayed from the speaking time, so you'll have to be a little schizophrenic in popping back and forth between the online real-time conversation and the slides that are slightly delayed. But we do look for the interaction.
Could you confirm that they see this on the bridge?
On the bridge, do you see the agenda slide?
Yes, we do.
I do.
Terrific. So all of your efforts are not in vain. The agenda that's now before everyone
Save that for the end of the meeting.
it illustrates my earlier point on how busy the schedule is. Usually we only try to get through the 5 working group updates with maybe a little bit of administrivia at the end, but we do, as I've already mentioned, have a major presentation to start us off, and then we do have the plan for the coming year as the final item. So we'll have to keep crisp in our presentations, try to have the presentation portion for each of the groups held to about 15 minutes, and that will allow the normal interactions that follow those sessions. If we can do that, then all will be well. With that, let's move into the first presentation, and I think you have this already.
Well, we got to get it up again.
Okay. And when it comes up, Patrick Haley will be sharing the we're finding the presentation here, but
I'll go ahead and start.
But the transition work, and
So
Patrick, you can describe where this comes from, and
I will just time check. How much time do we have here, just so I know how brief to be? 15 minutes?
Yeah,
15 minutes.
15 minutes.
Perfect.
Was the target.
So there's more slides than we actually need to go through, but nonetheless, you'll have them. So I think it goes without saying that the technology transitions issue in general is very much a top priority for Chairman Wheeler and for the Commission, for all the commissioners, frankly. And this task force, which I'll talk about a little bit, which was formed by previous Chairman Janikowski, is obviously came about as a recommendation of this group. And what I'm going to do is just sort of talk a little bit about what we've been doing and what's more importantly what we're about to do at the Commission. And so, Walter, you have the slides? Mm-hmm. So I'll skip over some of this stuff because some of these slides we have been using when we talk to some other folks out there in the States and other groups as well. But I think this first slide here on the changing communications landscape, this is not news to anybody around this table or on the phone. But the stats here come from one of our most recent local competition reports. And clearly the retail switched access lines are going down quite consistently at an annual over the last three years at an annual decline of 9% per year. On the other hand, interconnected voice-over IP subscriptions are rising quite quickly at an annual growth rate of 17%, and then mobile subscriptions, even at the highly saturated market as it is, are still going up at an annual growth rate of 4%. So this is not new, which is, I think, one of the things we've been saying for a while, that this technology transitions that we're all seeing are not new per se. They've been going on for a while now. Of course, the wireless-only issue is something where most households, not most, but nearly 40% of households are now wireless-only. And this is obviously a major issue for policymakers as we start to think about some of the legacy rules and where things are headed. What I do find interesting is that for the younger crowd, the 25 to 30 crowd, we're now at 60% roughly of households that are wireless-only. And, of course, more and more people are getting smartphones. We're seeing the rapid growth of 4G networks and gigabit cities. So clearly, and again, this is nothing new to anybody in this room, but these transitions are happening quickly. What I think is unique that the task force is looking at that's starting to be a little bit different is that these transitions, while voluntary, we're now getting to a point where folks are starting to talk about these transitions as not voluntary, where businesses are in a position where they've got old copper networks, or they have to make a decision where they deploy whether they want to extend copper, whether they want to do just a wireless service only, or just a pure IP service. And so what's different about the debate, and what we hear a lot when we reach out and talk to consumer groups in the States and others, is that what has been an ongoing transition has been a sort of complement to the traditional legacy services, whereas we're starting to transition to a world where these transitions are not just a complement, but might be the only option. And that's different, and that makes the policymakers' job a little bit more challenging. So with that as a backdrop, the next slide is, again, not something, I'm not going to say anything technical here because I'm just not going to embarrass myself. But lots of people talk about the IP transition as if it's sort of a single thing. And Julie or Henning or Walter, you can certainly jump in here whenever you want. But it's not a single thing, right? There's lots of things going on. There's physical networks that are, traditional copper networks that are being replaced with fiber. There's protocols being changed from TDM to IP. There's copper networks that are being replaced with wireless networks. And so the point here is only that there's not sort of a single issue transition going on here. There's multiple issues, and they all sort of have unique issues that come with them. And that's just a fact that we are aware of. And the task force looks at it not as a sort of single IP transition as if it's one thing, but the fact is that it's multiple transitions going on at the same time. On the next slide, please. So again, thank you for suggesting that the Commission establish a task force. We thought that was a good idea. And so we did form a task force. Chairman Janikowski did in December of 2012. And he said that it would conduct a data-driven review and provide recommendations to modernize the Commission's policy in a process that encourages the technological transition, empowers and protects consumers, promotes competition, and ensures network resiliency and reliability. And that's what we've tried to do. And one thing I think is important is that it's not as if we hadn't been thinking about these issues. Clearly we had, right? Voice over IP, for example, had been rolling out for a long time before this task force was formed. Wireless had been rolling out for many, many years before this task force was formed. And the Commission had already established rules and requirements on 911 and CALIA and outage reporting and things like that for VoIP services. And of course, we have those kind of consumer protections in place for wireless for a long time. So the task force wasn't looking at these things for the first time. The Commission had multiple proceedings ongoing that were relevant. But what the task force was trying to do and is trying to do is bring all these issues and all the people working on these issues together in a coordinated body to make sure that all these issues are not being looked at in a vacuum, but that all of these issues are being looked at together as one whole as the Commission looks at these multiple transitions. And so structurally, the task force, in case you're not familiar, is essentially includes leadership of all the major bureaus and offices at the Commission, from the Office of Engineering and Technology to wireless to wireline to Consumer and Government Affairs to the International Bureau even, where we look at what's going on internationally and try to make sure that where there are things we can learn internationally, we're aware of it here at the Commission. So we've been meeting regularly as a body since December of last year, and I will talk in a second about what we're doing. Next slide. So for Chairman Wheeler, he likes to talk about looking at these transitions through a couple different lenses. First, promoting growth, competition, and innovation in the communications marketplace. That's a priority for the Commission. But at the same time, while we're doing that, we have to preserve fundamental values, something that the chairman is referring to as the Network Compact. If you're not aware of it, there was an e-book that was just released, I want to say last week, where the chairman sort of lays out his perspectives on these issues, in particular defines what he means by the Network Compact. And it's consistent with what other commissioners have been saying about the fundamental values that we need to preserve for this transition, namely promoting and ensuring public safety, and that includes cybersecurity, which is a major area of focus for the chairman. It includes universal access, and I'll come back to that. It includes competition, as I mentioned before, and of course it includes consumer protection. So it's trying to promote innovation, promote competition, but at the same time ensuring that while we're doing that, we're maintaining certain core values that consumers have come to expect with the traditional services, but also understanding what those core values are and how they change with the deployment of new innovative services to make sure everybody has access to those services. So on universal access, I just want to point out that there's sort of a couple of different ways of looking at that. One is deployment, right? The physical network has to be available in all areas of the country, which ties into our universal service work. Two is it has to be accessible. Everybody has to be able to use the networks that are available. They have to be available and reliable, as the traditional telephone networks have been, and they have to be affordable. So there's a lot of issues sort of that go into what it means to preserve those fundamental values, and that's what the task force has been really looking at. I'm going to skip the next two slides, which are just quotes from all of our commissioners. The reason I included those was just to make it clear that before the chairman got here, the commissioners who were here were obviously very much focused on these issues. The chairman certainly is, and Commissioner O'Reilly as well. So in terms of actions to date, just to make sure everybody understands what this task force has done, we received a petition from AT&T, and we put that out for comment in December of 2012, so about a year ago. Similarly, we had received a petition from NTCA, the National Rural Association. And AT&T had requested, as I'm sure you're aware, that we approve some trials. The idea of doing a couple trials on transitioning their network to a full IP network in a couple of wire centers around the country, and also requesting that we sort of set up a proceeding to look at the multitude of issues that are impacting this transition. Similarly, NTCA had made that request. So we put those out for comment. We have a very thorough record in response to those petitions, lots of different perspectives about what was filed. We also established a separate docket, 13-5 is the docket number, and put out a public notice making clear that anybody who wanted to come in and make a presentation to this task force would have to file an ex parte, which it wasn't necessarily clear. We've held a workshop, which I thought was pretty illuminating in terms of bringing in a lot of different technologists to find out what networks are capable of today, where they're headed, how that should affect our thinking around the issues. And there's information, all the presentations are available. And in May, we issued a public notice sort of building on the record that we had already received in response to the AT&T petition, where we invited more detailed proposals on their concept of conducting a wire center geographic area trial, as they laid it out. And in addition to asking for more detailed comments, for more detailed proposals of that type, we also sought comment on some more what I'll call issue-specific trials, whether we should do something on VoIP interconnection, NG911, the transition from wireline to wireless in terms of what is a substitute for wireline, looking at issues like the future of numbering, whether we should do numbering trials, and a few other issues. And so we had comments on that over the summer in July and August, which brings us to where we are now, which this will be my last slide, and then we're happy to take questions. So again, when we put those ideas out for comment, I would say there was a mixed record in support of the proposals that the Commission had put forward in terms of those issue-specific trials. Similarly, I think it's safe to say there was a mixed record for the trials that AT&T had put forward in terms of their wire center trials. What the chairman has directed the task force and the Commission staff to do is two things. We're going to have a presentation at this Thursday's open Commission meeting from the task force. It will provide a little more detail and a little slightly different focus than what I've said today. It'll provide some more specific thoughts on the record and next steps. But that will be the first thing. And the idea there is to make sure that the full Commission, now that we have a full Commission, is aware of the task force activities and the record to date on the things I've just went over. And it'll sort of tee up where we're headed in January. And where we're headed in January is that Chairman Wheeler has instructed the task force, the Commission staff, to present the Commission with an item and an order to be voted on by the full Commission in January. And he put a blog out, I think it was November 19th, if I remember correctly. He put a blog out where he sort of instructed the task force to move forward with an item in January along three different lines. The first is he wants an order whereby the Commission, at the Commission level, will obtain comment and invite with some specificity in terms of what's required trials. So, for example, AT&T had essentially asked us to make it clear that we are inviting a specific trial and that we would put that out for comment and move forward with it. And as I mentioned, the Commission had proposed some other ideas in the May 10th public notice with some potential trial ideas. So I think the way you can think of this aspect of the January item is it's essentially a procedural order that says we see value in moving forward with a set of experiments and trials here is what you need to include in a specific proposal, whether it's along the lines that AT&T has specifically requested or a different type of a trial. Here's the minimum requirements. Here's the sort of set of expectations we have that should be included in a filing. So I would almost consider it more of a procedural order in that sense. Importantly on that, the chairman's made fairly clear that in his view, these are not technical trials. Okay, people know how to deploy IP services. People know what wireless networks are. They know what voice over IP networks are. They understand the technical issues. There may be some technical issues in terms of interconnection issues or other things, but as far as a trial goes, they're also not legal trials, right? There are certain issues that are legal, and the commission will have to decide. But most of those issues are not going to be resolved in the type of trials that we're thinking about here. These are end user impact trials, values trials, as Mr. Chairman Wheeler has described them. So let's do a trial. We do see value in a trial. Let's find out what the impact is on the consumer, the small business, whoever the end users are in a particular area where a trial is being deployed. The impact on public safety, the impact on any sort of end user potential impacts, and let's find out what those impacts are now, so that we can plan for that as policymakers. So point one for the January item is we're inviting comments, and here it's going to explain what we expect. And I would say this too: most likely the item will sort of say, here's when we expect these detailed plans to be filed with the commission. But I don't think the item's not been presented yet, but I don't think anybody suggesting it's sort of a one-time, you have to file it on this date. There may be an initial date, but I think the idea is that there could be potentially multiple proposals on a rolling basis that the commission would consider and put out for comment. And that will be the process, right? We'll put an order out, someone will file or put into the record a proposal, we will then seek public comment on it, and we'll go from there in terms of whether and how we proceed on trials. The second element of the January item is that he has tasked us with collecting data to supplement the lessons learned from experiments. Clearly, a major part of any trials or experiments that we do will be data and reporting. Otherwise, why do it? But there's also potential additional data that we may be able to gather that could be useful to help us with these transitions outside of any of these individual trials. Whether that's information on Next Generation 911, getting better data on current uses of wireless voice and broadband services by consumers to supplement things that are already being done, that kind of stuff. And then third, he tasked us with initiating a process for FCC consideration of the legal and policy issues outside of the trial setting. And this is the record is full of suggestions on issues like interconnection, IP interconnection, VoIP interconnection, essentially, last mile access issues, use of issues of copper retirement, these kinds of things where we have multiple dockets and pleadings in the record, which are probably just issues the FCC is going to have to decide one way or the other. And so he's looking for essentially a framework around which we will decide all of those issues, but not within the context of a trial. And so if you haven't seen the blog, it is November 19th. I encourage you to take a look at it. But that's what we're working on right now, is a presentation for this week, and then this item in January. The details of which, I've sort of described what it will be. The details are obviously something that's being worked on as we speak. So I just said a whole bunch. Hopefully half of it made sense. And Henning or Julie or Walter, anybody who's working on the task force, if you want to add anything, please do. Otherwise, if there's questions, we're happy to take them.
I think maybe one point you've made already, but it's worth emphasizing, is that this is the value of the TAC. This was an issue that was identified by this group about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, caused some press reaction, and now that dust has settled, people are seeing that this is the direction we're going, and Chairman Janikowski and now Chairman Wheeler are committed to taking this as an action item.
Absolutely, and I should say, certain trial proposals have gotten more press than others. But the bottom line is we are open to any sort of trial proposals that make sense to help us, make this transition happen as smoothly as possible. And so, there are lots of potential things that may be done in the form of a trial, and we welcome that input.
that there was one additional set of trials which were called out in the memo, particularly on numbering databases and the public notice, that was also strongly informed by the recommendation of the TAC.
Absolutely.
So there's one more specific concrete item that is still on the agenda directly following that discussion.
Yeah, and so was the VoIP interconnection issue. There was a lot of discussion on that, obviously, by this group, which is something that we're clearly looking at.
Any quick questions from members of the TAC? This is perhaps the most telling number was to see that we're now down to 40%. It is moving. It was identified by the TAC as something that was moving fast, but I guess many of us are even surprised at how rapidly things are moving. Russ?
Yeah, just a quick comment. One of the things we pointed out when we made that report was you were going to get to this point that, the hockey stick almost, but you level off, and without a push, you're going to get stuck there in terms of, what, and we're going to talk about this in our presentation today, in terms of what the network of record is. So we were hoping the FCC would be very proactive in trying to move that forward. What I would challenge the FCC with is, you're doing some of these trials. I think it's a good opportunity to be very bold in terms of what the future of, and I'll call it communications instead of telecommunications, is, because I think it's already happening out in the market. And the trials are happening today. So anyway, good luck in terms of the documentation and the trials.
Yes, we did.
Any other questions, comments? Very good. Thank you so much for being here with us, and Godspeed in getting this one done. It's really important. Moving back to the agenda for the TAC itself, the next item is to ripple through our working group reports. Prior to doing that, we have a very quick, and we're already a few minutes behind, so we're going to make this very, very fast, but a quick review of where we are circa September and all of the actions that have already been teed up by the groups. I'm sure you'll be repeating these, so I won't spend a lot of time, but I'm going to do it in one encapsulation of the accomplishments, recommendations, activities that have been performed, white papers produced, and so on. So flip forward and just ripping through them. And I'm not going to go through the details at all, but I will let you, insofar as you can read these small screens, take a look at the spectrum frontiers. But what I'm really looking for you to capture is that there is a lot that has been accomplished. And what I would share with you is that this past Wednesday, a week ago, that had an opportunity to share this information with our chairman, and it was really a very interesting session, the dynamics of which were, I had this information prepared in sheet form. I walked through the key accomplishments and more so the recommendations. As we would get to each recommendation, Julie was with me, and Tom would say, Julie, what are we doing about that? So there was this really neat dynamic. I teed it up, Tom hit it, and Julie, in most cases, had the opportunity to catch it, which was not exactly how I thought the dynamics would work, but it was really, really nice dynamics. And fortunately, that's a little bit in jest, but there are actions moving forward on most of these items, and the ones that aren't, our chairman is right there pushing to move forward. A few of them, some of you know Renee, his chief of staff, and she caught a few of them, but it was, for me, on your behalf, a very encouraging meeting just to see how seriously the proposals that are made from this group are taken, and the positive regard for the work that is going on. Most of you were there at lunch when Tom was able to address those directly to us, but I think while we had a very good relationship between the TAC and the previous chair, Chairman Janikowski, I think the opportunity for the relationship with our current chair is magnificent, and I really expect to have a lot of things happen and happen quickly. Let's quick.
Put the slides back up, please.
So this is the resiliency items. Again, I think we'll be reviewing these in some depth, but I again want you to just capture the items. The other thing you might take note of if you're looking more carefully is the number of workshops. I think it was observed that we have something like a dozen workshops that we've recommended. So we're workshop of the month recommended by the TAC. And we may have to do something about the number, but it really is a positive move forward. Continue with the COTS. Similar list of items, workshops and all. Next. Security and activities here, white papers and all. This group I'm always concerned about, the spectrum and receivers group.
The spelling. And the spelling.
Oh, yeah, and performance, yeah, that's... I thought you actually had corrected that, but...
According to Microsoft, I had.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So some things are not quite complete, which is what this represents.
And that's it. We're going to go to the resiliency
right.
next.
So next, let's move forward into the substance behind that top-level view, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of where we're going and even a little encouragement on how important these items are and the sheer magnitude. Again, that's more than reading the bullet by bullet. Even for me, looking at the breadth and the depth of the activities that are being pursued by this group is really quite inspiring. And it is for the chairman and actually for the team as well.
Yeah, we're all set to go.
So, with that, Rush, you're on.
Ready to go. Slides. Okay, so our working group was tasked with taking a look at what network resiliency looks like today and what it should look like in, for instance, 5, 10, 15 years, i.e., is the network getting better or worse? Next slide, please. So I want to thank and congratulate the team for, we made it through the year. We got a lot of work done, I think. And it's a fantastic team, by the way. We've got representatives or leaders, I should say, from across the different industries within the communication space. And it's been a pleasure working with everybody on this team. So hopefully the results show that as well. Next slide. So our premise slide, and I won't repeat too much of this, I think everybody's aware some recent fairly large natural disasters as well as man-made disasters or terrorist acts have brought to question some focus on network resiliency. And as a result, our group has looked at both natural and man-made issues. We wanted to address the network in whole. We started off with the end-to-end network and sort of carved out, as you'll see, a specific part of the network we thought was more vulnerable. And also it includes all technologies across the network, so it's not based on just the landline, for instance, as you'll see. And we also looked at items above layer 3. And some of the deliverables are a white paper, which the white paper is not circulated yet. We're going to send that out after post this meeting to the group for edits, and we'll take a quick look at that in the recommendation piece. And also we have some actionable recommendations. So next slide, where we talk about defining resiliency, we did that early on. And again, I think some of this is a little bit repetitive. We did focus on the distribution part of the network because we felt that is where probably the most significant issues are, or where they lie, so to speak. There's pretty good protection, I would say, in the backbone and the core. Protocols also we looked at and explored were in pretty good shape. There was not much that could be done or would be recommended to be done to address any of the protocol issues. We did took into consideration cloud, SDN, NFV, some of these new technologies and programmability capabilities that are coming online. That's addressed in the paper. And we also did a deep dive on metrics and data collection. And what we really feel is a good focus for the group, and where there's significant traction to date is the industry best practices in terms of dealing with some of these natural disasters. And we have some examples of those as well. Next slide. So as we took on this, there was a huge amount of work, and we broke into 3 groups. One was focused on the physical plant, and that was led by Doug Jones at AT&T, sorry, Verizon. Sorry about that, Doug. Verizon.
It's been transferred.
Yeah. We also looked at
one of those tokens.
That was just a bad slip. We looked at policy and current regulation and priorities, and that was led by Mark Bayless, and then looked at the metrics, forecasting, and I know it doesn't seem to be a perfect fit, but service substitution, we had to combine those two into one big group. We also met with a number of industry experts throughout the, I would say, 9 months or 10 months or so we worked on this. We had some meetings and liaison in terms of data collection with the FCC, and that's John Healy. We created an intent statement for data collection, and we had several members on the team that were liaisons to the security team, where we were not specifically focused on the cybersecurity piece. We felt the security team was really the place for that. And again, the white paper, special thanks to John Barnhill, who took the pen and was the editor and is still doing some of the heavy lifting on that paper, as you'll see. So next slide. What I want to talk about is today's network of record, and this is sort of a good follow-on to Patrick's presentation on the transition that's taking place, I think that everybody's aware of. If you go to the next slide. What we're seeing is clearly a drop in landline. If you just look at that bottom left, the blue chart, we've dropped from over 20%, almost 21% of landline only to 8.6% in the last 5 years. Also on the top, if you take a look at the pie chart on the top left, approximately 90% of households have a wireless phone in the house now. And what we feel is there's decent substitution. The bottom right chart talks about sort of the duality or different modalities of service that people are deploying, whether it's broadband, voice over IP, and 80% have either a smartphone and or broadband coverage within their home in the United States. That's percent of adults, not households, by the way. Next slide, please. The other piece that was clear when we talked about this, during the PSTN transition, it's also become a powering transition. The old network of record, as we call it, the PSTN, was what people years ago called, it was minus 48 volt power from the central office. With today's IP transition, as Tom Wheeler talked about at lunch, you have this much more capable, much more feature-rich and service-rich network, but at the same point, we've also introduced different areas where there's either powering or batteries per the chart there, whether it's fiber to the node, hybrid fiber coax, fiber to the home, or wireless. There's now multiple points of powering either in the network or in the home itself. Next slide. One of the nice things, though, and the text is a little bit messed up here, the industry has responded quite well in terms of how to handle this in terms of resiliency and restoration. There's Colts and cows, which are Colts on wheels, cells on wheels, cells on light trucks, and even rats. You have to love the sort of animal theme they've chosen. But they're used to provide rapid response and restoration to many of these events. And I think if you look at some of the disasters over the last few years, whether it's Katrina, whether it's Sandy, the windstorm that was fairly large tornadoes, the industry has responded quite well, including if you take a look at what's done in the cable Wi-Fi hotspots, they have a very good, I forget, there's a massive amount, and somebody will bring this up, how many? Over 200,000 Wi-Fi hotspots in the network that are shared during some of these disasters between those. And the other bullet there is there's also other providers that are providing a Wi-Fi access capability in the emergencies, maybe not as coordinated as some of the other ones there. But this is what we feel are some of the industry best practices. Next slide.
Well, they're pulling up the next slide. I just want to comment on how I just think what Russ shared on that first slide with what the wireless industry has done with things like cows and other things is such a great testament to what's happened as a result of competition. that even in the face of something like the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, no one wireless provider wanted to be known as not completely resilient, and so they've come up with and Ned could speak to that much more, but you've come up with some really innovative ways to keep your service running really, really, really well through even the most trying of times. So I think it's a real testament to what's happened because of competition. Yeah.
It's a good point. Is there a slide on, I should be on value of data. Okay, I can continue without them. So one of the things we created was a intent for collection of data, and it's really focused on getting to a position where better forecasting can be done, better prediction, and so forth. A great deal of data is collected today through programs called NORS and DERS, which we'll talk a little bit about in the next upcoming recommendations. There's also a good overview of NORS and DERS within the white paper as well. So I'm going to jump into our output and recommendations. We have right now, like I had mentioned, a white paper that's in progress. It's about 50 pages. It probably will end up being closer to 40 when it's fully edited down, maybe even less. What we cover in the white paper is a very detailed overview of network transition, i.e. where we are today and sort of what Patrick talked about. Communications resiliency, we'll be going through some of the industry best practices. Disaster planning and response. This includes sort of the data collection piece with NORS and DERS. And resiliency for public safety, we have a fairly good overview on what's going on in the E911 space, as that's clearly a priority. And I think it fits into the preserve the fundamental values presentation that Patrick made in his presentation. And then the reporting and metrics is we've got some data sections in there of much more detailed overview of what other areas could be leveraged, regulatory and agency cooperation, and then we have our recommendations and conclusions. So that'll be sent out to the rest of the TAC for review and any edits, and then made hopefully publicly available to the FCC. We're targeting end of December. It may spill over into January. So our first recommendation is for the FCC to sponsor an industry collaboration education material guidelines for consumer backup. One of the things we noticed when we were going through this is many consumers still don't know that what their options are or even what they might need. It's sort of left to, when you're in a disaster of, I don't have battery backup or I need battery backup for a lot of people still. So one of the things is we're recommending the FCC to explore working with DHS, FEMA, and the Ad Council to create or establish a fund that promotes consumer awareness. This is a critical element. We know that some of the service providers are very proactively doing this today, but it's still one of those things consumers need a little bit more focus on. Also collaborate with service providers and consumer electronics manufacturers to document power consumption for devices. And this will go on into the next subpart where we'd ask the FCC to promote the development of a CP efficiency and plug program with groups like CEA. And there's a workshop we call for at the end of the recommendations that goes along that line. Establish a challenge.gov type challenge from the FCC to promote or develop creative solutions to have customer communication services last at least 24 hours. It's a good opportunity to challenge some of the researchers out there, challenge students, or challenge companies to come up with a much more maybe energy efficient or battery backed up CPE devices.
Just a quick question. Is there any effort to, I suppose I should be hitting this given our, is there any effort to try to reach out to or into the power companies on this set of issues?
We're getting there.
Oh, okay, sorry. I didn't mean to, it just seemed like this is only like half the.
We have quite a few recommendations. Unfortunately, it's a little verbose. FCC to recognize there's also an evolving voluntary telecommunication industry agreement focused on energy efficiency, and there's a URL on the slides that you can take a look at. The next set of recommendations are optimizing the restoration process, where the FCC creates a national program on collaborative restoration. This is working with all the players involved, including service providers, power companies, agencies, explore creating potentially a data exchange or clearinghouse during the restoration process, providing estimated times for electrical services by areas, providing communication companies with power crew locations, better instruction to power companies not to do clear cutting of fiber cables that are still working or other communications cables that are still working. Place communication technical facilities at risk in outside plant locations critical to public and private sector utilities on a priority restoration list. So there's some work that can be done there. And then the next piece, which is more detailed to work directly, recommendation, which we call a reliability one, is the FCC to act as a catalyst and work closer with the power industry itself. This is reaching out to FERC and other power industry agencies to establish a much more focused approach. One of the discussions we had was along the lines of communication companies are having to build sort of a parallel electrical network in terms of reliability, which is one of the sub-bullets is we need to explore the impact of long-term backup and diverse power sources. Is putting tons of battery backups and generators the right solution, or is that, is there environmental impacts, things like that? They need to be looked at. The next recommendation is a dig once policy. We know that there is a 2011 executive order accelerating broadband infrastructure deployment. We'd like the FCC to encourage that further and push it down as best they can to the local and state levels. We feel they can do this by working with the Intergovernment Advisory Council, and this would also minimize disruption due to cable cuts. And also, I think there's a general feeling that longer term, if the cables are buried, there's probably a little better reliability there in terms of damage. Okay, so our data collection and metrics recommendation is one of the longer ones, so I'll try to hit the key points. But it's really about using network data sources to better track and predict and plan network resiliency for disaster preparedness. So we're calling for the FCC to work with providers to establish a better data and analytic capability with both current data and as they explore what other data might be used. But this needs to be done in partnership with the providers. The FCC to partner with the CDC. Interestingly enough, the CDC is where we got some of the data in terms of what people have in their homes. The CDC is great that they do this, but they probably could use some help in terms of the questionnaire. A lot of people need help in answering correctly the difference between a VoIP line and a wireline line, for instance. But I think there's some areas where the FCC could help partner with the CDC to get that information. Leverage the MBA data set, that's the Measured Broadband America data set, and explore where there may be some value for reliability and the long-term goals of both the MBA program as well as network reliability performance. And work with providers to determine what additional data is meaningful indicator of reliability. Develop a voluntary crowdsourcing capability. Of course, we need to observe privacy and proprietary issues when we do that. And create an annual network reliability baseline update. How do we know if the network's getting better if we don't have a baseline? That's one of the first things that needs to be set, really. And we have 3 FCC-sponsored workshops. The first one is consumer awareness, as we talked about in the first recommendation. The second one is working with CEA and other relevant parties to promote both energy efficiency plug programs and consumer advocacy groups. And the third one is Physical Infrastructure and Reliability Summit. We feel that the FCC could really build on the Hurricane Sandy rebuilding strategy, and we have a reference to this in the white paper, where there were very clear recommendations made in that report, but the FCC could collaborate with other government agencies and entities to, especially with regard to power in terms of reliability and restoration. So the last slide is not really a recommendation or it's a thought or two. We did not get consensus on the TAC. It was also talked about in the transition presentation by Patrick. And there's at least 2 sides to this this issue. And it really comes down to measuring the underlying VoIP network. And the 2 sides, one really is that market forces will drive service providers to deliver excellent service, and therefore we don't need any further measurements. The other is accurate data on performance of the communications network as a whole is required to ensure consumer protection and public safety. This is discussed much more on both sides in the white paper. We actually had multiple paragraphs that we cut down to a couple sentences here in the presentation for your review. That's it. Open to questions and comments. Again, I want to thank the team. It was a fantastic team, and it's been a pleasure to work with them over the past year.
I can't help but point out that in the resiliency presentation, we did have a network outage, which causes the disruption to the screens that you all observed. And yes. I thought that was well coordinated, Russ, to bring that in to underscore the points that you're making. So very, very cleverly done.
I won't bring up the airlines today.
But apologies to those who are out there and who had the disruption in the flow of the charts. They will be available on the FCC website afterwards so that you can catch up. With that, questions. Remember to use our standard approach of raising your tent card if you wish to communicate. Brian, you're on.
Sure. Thank you. This is Brian with CEA. So this is a good presentation. We'd love to be involved. We had a quick conversation at the end of last week. So at least on the energy efficiency side, there are a lot of parties involved there, and I've asked my staff to pull together some of the work we've done over the years. So my reaction is twofold. Efficiency is increasing very quickly, with or without a resiliency issue. There's just lots of factors for why products, in particular portable products for battery life, if nothing else, advance very quickly. But TVs, there's a lot of regulatory and labeling work going on there already. So there'll also be some jurisdictional issues because DOE, EPA are involved, FTC, so there's a lot to sort out. We'll give you lots of information. We've been heavily involved. We've worked a lot with NCTA on set-tops and TV and the kind of products that are consumers lease in the home. So I think those are 2 points. We have plenty of information. We've done some pretty big studies in the past where we try to accumulate, get a handle on how much energy is consumed by CE devices in the home, because there's a lot of anecdotes tossed around. Most of it's, particularly when somebody's trying to regulate products, they grab data. A lot of it's old. The efficiency changes so quickly. We've refreshed it, and we'll do a big study that'll release Q1 of next year that'll be very helpful to understand what products use how much power in the home. So hopefully that'll be helpful.
And Brian, how do you currently communicate that information to the FCC, or is it communicated?
So not so much, because it's not the agency that typically has proceedings in this space. We do lots and lots on Energy Star, measurement standards. We help Energy Star collect data on products so they can count number of compliant products. Like I said, DOE and FTC have even had proceedings related to labeling. I don't know if you've been in stores, you've seen in the last couple of years, TVs now have one of the yellow kind of energy guide labels. So that's what I'm saying. We haven't typically been asked. Where we have has been more on this messaging idea. So after emergencies, the FCC has come to us kind of informally and said, what's out there to help consumers charge their devices, have backup power and whatnot, and we'll help them find resources. There are lots of accessory companies, and you can do solar chargers, hand crank. There's lots of stuff out there, but that should probably be formalized and articulated in a more complete manner than the ad hoc basis we've done it so far.
Can I make a quick reply to that? By the way, we were not at all attacking the Consumer Electronics Association or that group. We understand everybody's getting more energy efficient. It's more or less pointing out that the reliance on the new communications network is, like for instance, if I have a VoIP phone, I probably have some type of DSL or cable modem, potentially a router, and then maybe the set itself. All three of those now require power. And one of the things we were looking into as well was, is there some type of daisy chaining capability or a common way to plug them together? And I don't think that's really the core of the problem. Most people in the U.S. don't have, for instance, UPSs or generators we looked into that as well, and it was relatively small in terms of the percentages. So this will become, one of the bullets I didn't get to mention on the slide, this will probably become a bigger and bigger issue as we move even towards, machine-to-machine and Internet of Things, and more devices become more powered in the home and so forth. So it's not an easy problem to fix.
Good. Henning.
So just to amplify that a little bit, and as much as we want to reduce the average energy consumption, that's clearly a necessity. The discussion in the TAC was trying to address two problems which go a little bit beyond that. The first discussion is that the average power consumption reduction generally is quite rightfully measured on typical usage. And we discussed at some point whether it is useful for devices to essentially operate in a possibly reduced functionality mode when they are battery powered, so that they can operate longer time, as is happening to some extent already for some of the ONT products, the optical network termination products, where they provide only voice service. Whether that's the right trade-off is a separate issue, because most people now expect some basic internet connectivity, for example, to get information about emergency-related services, in addition to just basic voice functionality. The second one is one of the practicalities. Brian, you mentioned the need to, or the ability, for example, to attach solar chargers or batteries, generally with many products today that are not designed for that. They have specialty lead-acid batteries, which require specialty connectors, chargers, etc. And the cellular industry in particular has been really successful, and you indirectly hinted at that, by having a uniform powering architecture. There's this whole ecosystem where you can buy batteries of all sizes and shapes that all plug into your existing cell phone or tablet and whatever. That doesn't work at the moment for access devices in that. And so I do believe there is an opportunity, and this is what the challenge.gov type of discussion might lead to address those three issues, namely the ability to have a coherent overall home powering environment, to allow long-term, possibly reduced speed or functionality devices that probably would need to reduce consumption to about 1 watt. Right now, 5 watts is pretty good for even a set-top box or modem. For reduced functionality, if you want battery power, you probably need 1 watt or so. So that's probably well below what we can achieve on an average basis, reasonably. And thirdly, to look at how we can leverage this large existing infrastructure and ecosystem that you mentioned for consumer home devices, which currently is not in place.
Good. Thank you, Henning. I think time is going to dictate that we move on, but thank you, Russ and team. Or Walter, did you have a quick comment?
Yeah, I'll try to make it quick. The work that's been done to date on the Technology Transition Task Force, at least to me, has identified that a lot of what we set as goals, objectives, and definitions are implicitly grounded in the domain in which you're working. And as we move to new technologies and new domains, really resetting what our objectives should be, what we're trying to measure, what are transferable goals, what are substitutable goals, seems to be a large part of the overall problem. In looking at resiliency and recognizing you're going to a different technology base with positive and negative trade-offs, have you looked at the issue of what are we trying to do, what are the goals, and what do we should be measuring in terms of the whole reference points that we take for granted, going from an environment which is over 100 years old to an environment in which things are going to change and things will be different and measurable in different ways. Have you looked at that as an issue?
So we have a little bit. We didn't want to get bogged down too much in terms of where we got the data. Mm-hmm. One of the areas that was fairly interesting was the crowdsourcing idea, which may be a good source of data, just as the MBA program has an app you can install on your device, which you could put a little plug-in for. But I think it's an opportunity to get additional data potentially. So one of the things we did call out in our recommendations was overview or review of NORS and DERS. The one thing we didn't want to create a burden to any of the providers in terms of, because gathering data can have some cost to it, so we didn't want to put that burden on the providers. We wanted to find out, where we are today, what data is going to be of use and value, and maybe go from that point.
Good. Let's move forward, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end to talk about some of these things, especially as it applies to the moving forward. The next group is the Spectrum and Receiver Group, a group I remember something about. But Lynn Cloudy, would you please take the lead for the group today?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Chairman of the working group. As many of you know, Dennis Roberson is fulfilling dual duty here. So let me start by saying thank you to Dennis for all the work that he's done and is an excellent leader for the group. And my job here is just to try to chronicle the progress and the recommendations under his leadership. So if we could go to the next slide.
We're trying.
Next slide.
Okay.
I think we may have to do double time on resiliency, Russ.
I could do it again.
Try slide. See if slide 2 comes up.
And we are having technical difficulties today, Did
you get it?
Yeah.
Okay. Put the slide back up.
There we go. Important slide. This is the makeup of the Spectrum and Receivers Performance Working Group. There is a wide range of communications industry representatives and manufacturers and former regulators and venture capitalists in the group. And we continue to have the benefit of current regulators as well, with under the direction of Julie Knapp advising us, along with the very able Bob Pavlak and Matthew Hussey. So it continues to be a privilege to work with them as well. Next slide. This was the original 2013 mission for the group, and certainly the working group has done a lot on these areas, developing and socializing the concept of interference limits policy. That continues as a subject of investigation. And more generally, the mission of the group is looking at various aspects of improved access, more efficient spectrum use, and taking a holistic systems approach wherever possible instead of piecemeal. So this includes the issue of clarifying how spectrum access rights are defined and how interference is affected by both the emission and the reception ends of a communication system. And as well, an exploration of methods to motivate improvements in receiver performance, especially in an era of increased spectrum congestion and a bias, in our group at least, towards not mandating receiver performance standards but looking to industry solutions. Next slide. Today we're going to report on 4 specific areas that have been particular areas of focus this year: interference limits policy and the role of underneath that multi-stakeholder organizations, a radio system standards knowledge base, emerging receiver technologies, and topics on interference resolution and enforcement that speak to modernizing how conformance and resolution of interference matters may take place in the future. Next slide.
We have a slight technical issue, so we're going to switch slides in about a minute.
Okay.
This is by virtue of our group continuing its trend. This morning, the group met for 2 hours, and as Walter has always pointed out to us, final means nothing to our group when we put it in the subject line of a memo.
That's the disc he gave. That's the disc he gave us. Which of the ones should we be pulling from?
No, it's the top one. You just didn't get it, unless I messed up.
It says it already does. That says that it already exists.
Okay, go ahead. Just continue with it.
This is just. All right. Okay. That's.
Should be the one. Oh, that's the right one.
All right. All right. We got it.
Okay, we're back. There we go. So we'll go into the next slide. Excellent. This year, this is a somewhat review. This has been quite a productive year in developing further the interference limits policy concept. The white paper that was authored by this working group was put out on public notice in April, and public comments were filed in July and August. The group looked at candidate bands for where would be a good place to run a pilot project to test out the whole concept, and made the recommendation at the last TAC meeting in September that the FCC should look at the 3.5 gigahertz band to encourage development of a multi-stakeholder group to run a pilot program on developing harm claim thresholds underneath interference limits policy guidelines to see how well it worked. Next slide. A few highlights from those white paper comments. There was generally very broad support for defining the environment in which receivers would be expected to operate. But at the same time, most commenters generally said that it was a nice idea, but it would be best if it was applied to other services other than to the ones they represented, which is kind of a yin and yang going on there. There was also, though, broad support for using multi-stakeholder organizations to determine harm claim thresholds. But at the same time, again, there were a lot of cautionary notes about how each situation is different. It's very hard to generalize. You cannot do a one-size-fits-all template. And then finally, there was support for a pilot project to be authorized by the FCC, wherein this concept, where there was kind of this back and forth, we think it's a good idea, but we're not sure, kind of thing could be worked out in a real situation in the real world to see if it really had application or not. Next slide. Underpinning interference limits policy is the idea of using multi-stakeholder organizations to develop the actual criteria, the actual harm claim thresholds. And what a multi-stakeholder group would do could be very much a variable on a continuous scale or on a continuum. At one end, it could just simply be a group that defined general principles, how to look at things like the statistics of interference and whether you should just look at the current environment or whether you should plan for the future. Or another activity, a little more detail, would be to actually identify the parameters that were to be measured. Which parameters are you going to measure them? What methodology do you use? But stop short of actually determining the parameter values. But of course, they could go farther and potentially determine the parameter values that would become the harm claim thresholds and take into account all the various factors that would pertain to making that determination. And then lastly, the notion that the multi-stakeholder group could also be used to discuss or define mechanisms or processes, whatever was needed to enact effective enforcement of those harm claim thresholds that they may have determined. So what the right balance is for what a multi-stakeholder group should do on that continuum, all the way from the easiest frame general principles to the very hard enforcement functions, is not something that we were able to come to closure or conclusion about. But again, a pilot program that actually puts some of this into practice, we think, would be very helpful in finding out what role a multi-stakeholder group would be able to contribute. Next slide. In September, the working group floated the notion of the FCC providing a web-accessible repository for standards and recommended practices on receiver performance. That would be specific to mainly interference immunity. The suggestion in September was to perhaps provide a link from the Spectrum dashboard, the FCC Spectrum dashboard, to various receiver standards that were applicable in a particular band. Well, we looked at that between September and now as to how that could be implemented and how practical it was. And between all the logistical and the other challenges, it appeared to be quite a daunting thing to do, easy to do in theory, not so easy in practice. So the working group has been looking at other approaches. And one approach that we looked at that we may have some promise came from a session that the group held with the organizer of a website called SpectrumWiki.com. That's a website that offers information about allocations, and it has pointers to relevant regulatory proceedings, and it does it on a band-by-band basis throughout the spectrum. It's run on a voluntary basis. It's free. It's open to the public. So this might be an appropriate environment that comes really from the industry for sharing receiver standards as links. We're also exploring developing links between SpectrumWiki.com and the FCC Spectrum Dashboard, either as a general kind of link or perhaps on a more granular basis on a band-by-band basis. And then secondly, this group feels that a workshop of academic researchers and government researchers and industry practitioners in radio system standards specifically would be a useful activity, a useful event in identifying what are the needs of regulators, what are the needs of service planners, what are the needs of manufacturers in order to operate in the challenging environment of RF spectrum that we find now. And those government researchers would include more than just the FCC, and we're proposing that this might be a co-sponsored FCC, NTIA, and NIST kind of workshop to bring all the government under one into one panel, hopefully with common goals. Next slide. One of the conclusions that has been drawn since September was that since standards are really the province of standards development organizations, maybe the SDOs themselves could be urged to volunteer to maintain a readily accessible standards knowledge base instead of the FCC doing it for them. So our working group's recommendation is for the FCC to issue a notice of inquiry to initiate this kind of action by the SDOs. If you had an NOI released, it could certainly explore the relationship between existing standards and developing interference limits policy issues. It could ask for guidance on what should be in any minimum set of receiver performance specifications. It could ask receiver developers what are their needs for parameters to be developed and ask for requirements on conformance testing and specifications. But in any case, the SDOs may be able to provide some valuable information exchange for spectrum users and for the agency itself in looking at interference and spectrum management. Next slide. Also in September, we identified some of the impediments that need to be overcome by receiver designers as going into the future and operating in an unknown future RF environment and certainly a more congested RF environment. So the group is in the process of putting together what we are calling a set of technology notes, which is something less than a white paper, but something more than a casual report. But these technology notes will be available by the end of January and will address 4 basic areas of receiver improvements. First of all, receiver hardware technology. This would include how is linearity improving in front ends in terms of conventional measurements like third order intercept point, dynamic front end filtering, and so forth. Then we would also look at, or the notes will look at advanced dynamic interference cancellation techniques, things such as phased antennas and other techniques. It will look at the general topic of software radio, a big topic where software-defined radio is feasible in some cases now, at least in some parts of radios, at least at the IF stage and forward. But the big advancement would be, and somewhat controversial, is how feasible is direct RF conversion to digital at the front end, such that everything from the antenna terminals through the rest of the receiver is fully digital, and then you get all the flexibility and hopefully performance improvements and linearity, selectivity, as well as the digital flexibility of being able to upgrade in the field. So the challenge here is design and practicality of A to D converters that can do this, that have the dynamic range and performance necessary to make all those theoretical advantages into real advantages. And then finally, the Tech Notes is going to cover the topic of dynamic spectrum allocation and coordination, whereby the users that are going to be sharing spectrum also then coordinate among themselves so that spectrum efficiency is increased, but without having service collisions and interference that they can't tolerate or that they haven't negotiated. Next slide. Another area where the group plans to have a broad white paper compiled and completed by January of 2014 is the general subject of interference resolution and enforcement. This is the first of two recommendations, which is for the FCC to take early steps to release publicly in summary form information on interference complaints and investigations, including ones that are voluntarily resolved by the affected parties. So why are we making that recommendation? The rationale goes something like this. We are in an area where there is literally explosive growth in wireless systems, and these systems have to operate in an increasingly close proximity to one another, either in space-time, frequency, or all three. And you couple that with rapid technology changes, operational and business, accelerated trends, and what happens is that fundamentally the interference environment is changing. But the methods of enforcement by regulatory agencies are not, and perhaps those traditional methods of interference resolution and enforcement will be challenged beyond the capability to respond to the technological changes. The Commission is also faced with more cases of intentional interference. We have malicious interference and even non-malicious interference that's done for all the right reasons, but it's still interference nonetheless. So the Commission routinely collects interference complaints and information about problems in service reception, but only a limited amount of that gets out to the public. You get the formal actions against licensees if they're violating the rules, but you don't necessarily get all the complaints that are filed. Some of that for very valid reasons if it's an ongoing investigation. But we think there are public benefits to be had by the regular release of aggregating information on interference complaints and investigations, including those that never rise to the occasion of Commission action but are voluntarily resolved. Academic and government researchers would find this very valuable. Industry researchers, system designers, and incumbent providers and new entrants all would have some kind of benefit, even advisory groups like the TAC. If the TAC were perhaps tasked eventually to propose what's the new strategy that we need to go to or to recommend to the FCC to modernize interference resolution and enforcement activities, because status quo may not be sustainable as the trends of more services and more devices and less spectrum continue. Next slide. This is the second recommendation in this area from the group, and it's somewhat of a follow-on activity. And I'm actually going to just read it. It's the Commission should convene a workshop of A, academic researchers and their funding agencies working in the field of interference resolution and enforcement, and B, practitioners and other experts in the field of interference resolution and enforcement from within the Commission itself and other federal government agencies such as NTIA. So the reason for this recommendation is really it's an acknowledgement that there is quite a bit of an increase of research interest in the topic of interference resolution generally. That's been driven by external and internal factors, the growth of acceptance of techniques such as dynamic frequency sharing, one of the keys to accommodating that explosive growth in wireless communication services. You can find evidence in the database-driven DFS systems that are in the TV white space area or other applications. There is supporting research being funded by National Science Foundation and DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and others, both in the U.S. and abroad. So, based upon all this increased research activity, we suggest that there could be significant public benefits produced by communication between the researchers and between the Commission and others in the field. The Commission itself would benefit by gaining exposure to the latest research results, and that might be incorporated into its rulemaking procedures or into the Commission's internal interference resolution and enforcement activities. Next slide. We have discussed next year topics as a separate item here in the slides, but there's some overlap with ongoing work. But the basic question of what should this work group do in 2014, or should it do nothing and disband? Whether it continues or not is a question for TAC leadership and the Commission ultimately. But if we do continue, we would posit that there is work to be done. First of all, we have the two papers previously mentioned, the first on emerging receiver technologies and the second on interference resolution and enforcement policy recommendations. Those should be, as I mentioned, done in January. Another activity is to stick with and move forward with implementation of a multi-stakeholder group for developing harm claim thresholds in the 3.5 gigahertz band, which is a live issue. It's an ongoing proceeding, and we think it's the low-hanging fruit for that pilot project in interference limits. Next slide. Under the category of new work items, we have several proposals, the first of which can be put under the general umbrella of interference, resolution, enforcement, and noise. The first item would be to investigate a formal way to share information on interference incidents in a public-private partnership. Second, to look closely at new strategies for interference resolution and enforcement in this new crowded spectrum world and highly efficient spectrum world. Third, to investigate the commonly held assertion that the noise floor is rising. Everybody says it, except that they don't have a lot of studies to really lean on to provide some empirical evidence or to refute the assertion. But if it's true that the noise floor is rising, the second question is that a problem for services, or is it just something that's relatively a benign phenomenon and something to simply note in passing? And finally, on the transmission side, the question of whether emission limits need to be changed. The standard FCC formula for specifying out-of-band emissions, is it out of date? Does it need changing? Does it need to be tightened? Can we loosen it? Those are all questions for potential TAC work in 2014. Next slide. And this is the last one. One last item we think is on the subject of frequency sharing technologies and the practicality of making them work. The notion of a test city, of a pilot test city, came up in the PCAST report from mid-last year. That idea of a test city is, we think, gaining momentum, although it hasn't gone to fruition yet. But there's likely going to be a need for a test city to test out spectrum sharing proposals, and there may be some TAC work to do there. Secondly, the agile technologies for frequency sharing and for service coexistence need to be evaluated in the real world as well as theoretically, and we ask whether there is something the TAC can do in facilitating both federal and non-federal spectrum sharing, as this kind of arrangement, which is coming out now in the public, will tend to proliferate in the near and the midterm future. So with that, I think that completes our review of the progress of the Working Party. There are many members of the Working Party here, including its chairman, and any or all of them would be pleased to try to answer any questions.
And are there any questions? I don't see any tent cards jump. Oh, there we go. Peter, you're on.
Too quick.
So it just strikes me.
We're fighting over the mic here.
But Peter's first.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Good.
I was just wondering if the group looked at carbon tax credits as one sort of economic mediating mechanism that's very similar to some of the things that we're struggling with in this domain. And basically, if I step on your frequency, maybe that's okay as long as I pay you for the privilege of doing it.
I think the quick answer is no. The group hasn't looked at it.
So I'm suggesting it might be an idea to look at because it works pretty well, or at least has some really interesting positive consequences in the private sector.
Right. Jesse, go ahead.
First, let me say that I think that report was an excellent piece of work, and particularly dealing with this issue, which is addressing interference policy limits and the need to address that, because one of the challenges of moving forward with SDR is the ability to create an ecosystem around that, and we're not going to get there unless someone grabs the bull by the horn and start to define what these threshold parameters are and what the values are. And I think it's just critical if you look at the type of work that this group has done. I was a part of it at the beginning quite a while back. I'm in a different group now, but I just wanted to emphasize you must keep this work going, because I think it's really going to shape what happens with the rapid allocation of spectrum, these multi-protocols that are out there, mostly multi-bands that are spread all over the place, and companies like ours that are trying to figure out how do we do effective spectrum sharing when there are no parameters by which we should judge what we're doing. And as a result, you're not going to be able to create the kind of SDR ecosystem that will push that technology forward that address both, not just the type of work we do in small cells, but in the network radio systems as a whole, as well as the devices. So I just wanted, it's not a question as much as it is a statement that I think this is a group that we need to keep going, and we need to start to nail down some of these things and not just hope it's going to happen, because that's not really working.
Good. Thanks, Jesse.
Good point. Okay. Well, I found it interesting that the 3.5 gigahertz, because that's an interesting one, because there's contention on both. You've got celestial and terrestrial. You've got your grandfathered Earth stations that fall within that realm as well too, where they have protected areas and zones. Mm-hmm. So, have you got any work done on that as far as how the frequency interference and coordination would be between the celestial and the terrestrial on that 3.5? Because I think you've hit on a frequency that's in a good point, because it hits a lot of topics as far as spectrum and noise interference.
No, maybe we'll let Pierre respond to this if you want to, Pierre, wherever you are.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and in fact, that's one of the reasons why we were interested in 3.5. We did some preliminary analysis of satellite Earth stations in the white paper. We'll be looking at this in more detail next year if the work continues in terms of scoping the 3.5 gig multi-stakeholder.
Okay.
So, I think that the question is more a matter of when, not whether.
Okay.
So, one of the focus has been at 3.5. You probably are aware we've been doing a lot of other work, and John's back there too. John's done a lot of work on the 3.5 proceeding. We've got a workshop coming up on January 14th, if I remember right. And so we're still working on some of the pieces there. Part of the charge for this group, the recommendation is to put a little bit more meat on the bones as to exactly what, if we set up this multi-stakeholder process, exactly what would the charge look like to the group, and how would we get it started. So, we're taking it very seriously at the Commission, and I think it's just a question of when we start that process.
Yeah. The other, in addition to sort of how it
do you want to come up and grab a mic for those on the line?
In addition to sort of what is the process, I think also what's the scope, because there are a number of sort of receiver-oriented interference issues raised in that proceeding, and some of them are backward-looking with respect to incumbents. I think maybe a little more challenging to deal with. Some of them are forward-looking with respect to new entrants in the band and how they treat each other. So I think that's all grist for the mill that we'd hope people would think about.
Great. With it?
Just one last small comment. I agree. That was a great presentation. Yours is always one of the best. I wanted to ask about the recommendation for the workshop. I guess I was surprised to see it just comprised of academic researchers, because if you're trying to look at the field of interference resolution and enforcement, I think we would learn more from the resolution by also having some of the operators. We're today dealing with a whole new level. I mean, every year this is true going forward, but now that many carriers are using the 700 megahertz spectrum, we're dealing with new kinds of interference there, which would be, I think there'd be great findings in that as well.
Yeah, this is a fun one in that we debated this.
Really?
And so I'm going to turn this over to Dale.
I don't want to debate with Dale. I rescind my question.
About 2 hours ago, we were debating this exact question. I defended a little bit the what is in the recommendation is that having...
He created the recommendation, too, by the way.
Having dealt recently with a lot of the academic research that's going on, and also talking a lot to our Enforcement Bureau, it seems like there is sort of a gap there that needs to be filled in. I think exactly what you're saying from the internal experience, there's a lot to be learned, and I think from the academic researchers. So it was almost matter as an initial step or scope step to sort of, since there is this research going on, to make sure it's focused right and so forth. But that would not preclude at all, in my mind, then something subsequent that would open it up to people in the industry. Mm-hmm. And maybe we need to rethink it. But that was the initial rationalization. But literally 2 hours ago or 3 hours ago, we were having the exact debate.
Debate phase 2. All right, let me turn it over for a quick one for those on the line. I don't want to neglect you. Any questions from those out in the hinterlands or comments?
Please verify the line still there.
Would someone just verify that the line is still there for Walter?
Yeah, we're still here.
Okay.
We're still here.
Okay,
Ed. Yep, clear.
Very good. Okay, Ed, you do have your card up.
Just real quick, on the question of getting more early release on interference complaints and investigation stuff, can you clarify on what that purpose is for? Because it almost gets to me to the point where there are a lot of those kind of interference issues that Nomi kind of pointed out before, where it could be a customer who grabbed a phone from overseas and bringing it on over here and then started interfering. Is the intent to try to collect all of that kind of information to now then figure out where there's a transmitter problem or receiver problem? I'm trying to get a little lost in terms of where we're trying to get to there.
I think that goes back to Dale somewhat, right? But generally this is trying to look at the intention of the Enforcement Bureau and how interference is resolved, and balance that with the kinds of reports of interference that are actually existing now in the real world, which are changing from what they were when those enforcement policies and procedures and systems were originally put in place. So if nothing else, it's a sanity check on does organizationally the structure of interference resolution and enforcement work for the kinds of manifestation of interference that it is appearing in the environment. But Dale has a more theoretical view, I think, that is more well developed than that.
No, I think you said it very well. A lot of this is gathering some fundamental information on what types of interference incidents are most prevalent today and so forth, so we can provide some focused attention. Plus, we've got some new situations where, in a very dynamic world, you've got the commercial entity sharing with federal government entities, and how one goes about resolving interference between those two dynamically. We have static sharing, but this is a different world where the interference obviously can be much more transient and so forth. So how do we deal with that? What are the processes for working across the federal, non-federal boundary would be an example of something we'd want to look at, I think.
Okay, very good. Let's move on to our look to the future, Spectrum Frontiers. Brian?
Thank you. So, slides.
They're there.
There we go. Yay. All right, Spectrum Frontiers Working Group. Next slide. So again, I want to thank Michael Ha and John Leibovitz. Michael, especially. I mean, John. We've had a lot of help from the FCC. Michael dug into some areas of research, understanding allocations and service rules in parts of the rule book many of us never look at. So thank you, Michael, for that. And working group members for hard work. A lot of healthy discussion. And again, in areas and frequency bands we don't look at very often, so it was, I hope, educational for many of us. All right, next slide. So just a quick recap. In September, we made some specific recommendations, and not surprisingly, the recommendations are a little bit more concrete as you, in the lower frequencies, sort of closer in to what we're doing commercially today. So there's a recommendation, and just as a reminder, we've pretty much broken things out in three big bands, so to speak, kind of that 30 gigahertz range, 95 to 275, and then up in the terahertz range. So what's transpired since then, we made the recommendation about looking at potential application in 30 to 40 gigahertz. We had some intermediate findings on 95 to 275 and continued to do some work there. And then we've talked about some of the research activities in terahertz. Since that time, the IEEE USA petition was released as a public notice, and that has to do with rulemakings and waivers above 95 gigahertz. So what we'll do today, we'll just do a quick update on what we've seen transpire around that 30 gigahertz band, some additional work we've done, 95 and up, and lastly, just what we're seeing happening in terahertz with some recommendations, but I don't think they're overly concrete to act upon. Next slide. So this is a repeat of the recommendation we made that the Commission take action that may include an NOI. We didn't want to be overly specific on what action the FCC might take, but to look at possibility of mobile broadband, the adoption of a service in this band, and that as we look for much higher mobile broadband speeds, we're interested. We think it'd be fruitful to have a workshop in this area, and we need to look at, there's some global harmonization issues that are going on here that should be understood, and then what kind of technologies are being developed to serve what I think a lot of people are starting to call 5G as a general handle for that. And then lastly, there's the ITU discussion and the role that U.S. can play in the WARC 15 that would set up an agenda item for WARC 18. Next slide. Okay, so the market has not stood still. The ITU. So what we're hearing from there is that there is an effort underway on the WARC 18 agenda formulation to then have a formal discussion at WARC 18, and really that centers around how you might specify these bands, and I guess I would say how specific they are in terms of their reference to particular mobile broadband technology. And so we don't have a direct impact on that. U.S. obviously will have a position that I'm sure is being developed by the right people involved. On the commercial side, we see a great deal of activity. Samsung has made some presentations. There was a TA workshop just about 2 weeks ago, I think. IWPC has done additional work. Intel has talked about their efforts in this area. Well, in particular, 60 gigahertz, and maybe taking some of their developments and actually running it at lower bands. So, Intel's been highly involved in the WiGig work at 60 gigahertz. Ted Rappaport at NYU, he's been very active in this millimeter wave kind of 5G work, and I'll have a chart from him in just a second. Nokia and NYU are doing stuff. We're likely to see, and I'm guessing we'll see a lot of workshops and summits and groups coming together to look at what might become 5G mobile broadband. Europe has a formal program, part of their framework, the 7th framework, so they're looking down the road. And not surprising, they have a fairly organized and structured approach to developing their next generation broadband system. So the last bullet is sort of a takeaway for us. It's clear that to get to a big step up in broadband speeds, you're going to need wide bandwidth. But when you start getting above 20 gigahertz, there are some tough problems to solve. Related to directionality, attenuation, antennas, and steering, and lots of things we talked about in some detail in our group. Next slide. Okay, this is not super useful for you in real time here, but perhaps in your presentation. So we want to make clear, one of the things that's important when you start looking above 5 gigahertz or so, the physics of the propagation is really important for who's claiming or who's trying to use certain frequencies for certain applications. So here's a good representation from New York University of the atmospheric effects in these ranges. Pretty wide range here, but you can see what's going on. The overall attenuation is increasing. There are some places noted there where you have these peaks in attenuation that are related to the physics of the atmosphere, and that causes you to want to do certain things in certain bands where attenuation may be helpful for short-range communication, and where you have less attenuation, you're much more interested in maybe point-to-point, longer haul. Long haul may be a couple of hundred meters in the case of a 5G kind of system. And on the right, as we caution ourselves in our working group, it's not all easy up here in these bands. Rain and foliage can have a huge effect. And let me drill down a little bit on the rain issue. I want to thank Marvin for getting us this slide. Next slide, please. So if you look at it, ignore the details. You can look at it on your way home or something. You can see the highly squiggly black line.
Parties, you use this one.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So you can talk to your significant other about this if you ever want to have an engaging conversation. The black line kind of tells you what's going on as a baseline of the atmosphere. You can see there, but maybe more important to understand are the blue lines that go through there that show attenuation due to different levels of rain. The top blue line is what they call excessive rain, but heavy rain is adding about 10 dB of attenuation by itself. I think I've seen, at least in Samsung's presentation, so as we think ahead to these kind of networks, you should not think about these bands as being your only form of communication, because there are going to be times when they're not going to work. So this will be like the resiliency discussion. This is the fast part, but it may not be there all the time for you. Okay, so that's kind of it on that band. It's very promising. A lot of commercial work going on. I think we have some recommendations there. Hopefully the FCC can act on. Now looking ahead to 95 to 275. So what's interesting here is the way things are allocated. And if you look at the whole package, and actually this is true all the way past 275 on up to terahertz. There are wide swaths of spectrum that are allocated for passive. So what's kind of complicated here is, you look at these huge bands, but you don't get a lot of it to yourself for commercial or active services or federal. So if you look in the middle of the section that shows overlap, there's 76 gigahertz of overlapped co-primary usage between commercial and passive. So just a way to convey there are a lot of things allocated here, and it's not necessarily trivial to get sole use of a big chunk. Coordination with passive services. So we had a great discussion with some of the people involved in radio astronomy, which is probably the simpler of it is the simplest of the passive service to coordinate. The first bullet I just mentioned, there's something on the order north of 60% that's allocated for passive. And so far, coordination with at least radio astronomy is pretty well understood. I think the right kind of dialogue happens. When we talk to, for example, people at NSF about how they coordinate, so they feel like it's been pretty successful. They are worried about what they call the consumer applications. For example, automotive radar, when starting to operate up in the 70, 80, 90 gigahertz range, and now they're getting out there. So typically you haven't seen high volume application of stuff in these frequency ranges, so that worries them a little bit. And that's the reference to the mass market services and devices. Now, the other kinds of passive services, these can be much more difficult. When you have an airborne or space science, things looking down, now it's not so trivial to coordinate. And last bullet is really a reference to the fact that, as we've talked about a lot with trying to coordinate with federal users, it can be really hard to figure out who is actually using something and for what purpose in these, or have something planned in the future. These may be really long-term projects, so it's hard to sort out. Quick comment, next slide, on DARPA. So this is the DARPA 100G program, which is likely to do some fundamental development in doing really high speed. This is meant to be kind of fiber optic equivalent RF links. And so we think, it's going to be operating up in the bands that we've been discussing here. So there are some companies that have been awarded some initial work in this area, and so I'd expect to see more come out of this. I don't know, what can be reported exactly, I don't know. We shall keep going. Next slide. Okay, so 95 to 275, commercialization and technologies. So we're getting in the range here. The reason for this chart doesn't show up, so I don't know if it's in the.
It's correct here, but
okay, yeah.
It's a projection issue.
So there's a complicated chart, and the purpose of that chart is really to help convey. I was trying to figure out how do we explain this change in silicon technology. Oh, is that it? So this crossover from silicon-based ICs and RF components to a whole set of other, much more esoteric, these 3.5 semiconductors. And that chart helps explain where they come into play. What's important is that things are happening. We're kind of on this edge of high-volume commercialization in some of these areas. So we know how the propagation works. CMOS has moved up, really tremendously in the past 10 years or so. It's amazing what they can get out of CMOS. But still, as you go above 95, you're outrunning CMOS and having to do some other kinds of semiconductors. The last sub-bullet on here, we've had some debate. So spectral efficiency, if you just look at it numerically, as you go much faster, you can argue you lose some spectral efficiency just in a bits per hertz sense. And some of it has to do with if you use old school techniques, frequency multipliers and whatnot, it does become less efficient. But when you go really fast, you can start working it from the entirely other direction. You can do optical techniques, and there's some promise there to get back that efficiency. Driving commercialization. Okay, so this is the crux of our chicken and egg argument that our working group spent probably the most time in debating the 95 to 275 gigahertz. And it's really what will cause more things to be done commercially above 95 gigahertz. Is it a demand issue that the applications and the demand is insufficient? In other words, we can apply cheaper technology and solve our problems, or is it a certainty issue? There are no service rules above 95 gigahertz. So that's the question. If we had certainty, would there be more demand? And we could not untangle this. There's facts on both sides. And so we just tried to recognize that in our recommendations. Next slide. On the more certainty is needed side, this argues that if we had maybe not specific service rules, but some certainty about above 95 gigahertz, then investments would follow. There's clearly you can get access to pretty big blocks of spectrum, maybe not all that you want because of this issue of the passive services sprinkled in there. So there is an argument that service rules would facilitate capital investment in new technologies. An argument that the U.S. is maybe behind here or should kind of get on the stick to stay current on above 95 gigahertz. And that market demand will follow that there's sort of a latent lack of investment due to the lack of service rules. On the other side is that investment happens. If you look at the statement we made in our multiband discussion, the way it was always put in that group was investment follows opportunity. So people are spending the reinvestment in CMOS and traditional silicon development is what's gotten all this speed improvement and why we can do so much in 20 gigahertz on up to 60 gigahertz. And therefore, it's sort of a natural outcome that you have less investment in these esoteric semiconductor technologies. Next slide. So here's the other side, kind of the risk and benefit of acting in this area. On the risk side is that, first thing you do may not be the right thing. So if you try to kind of guess at what rules you need too early without obvious applications and without all the development, you may not serve, you may miss the mark, so to speak. And so there's two bullets there that deal with that, that how we pick licensed or unlicensed use may not best serve the public interest. On the other hand, the benefits are that those who are working in this area, trying to make advancements, they would probably have easier access to capital if there were some definitive rules in this space. And that, as I mentioned earlier, that there are good bands to do really high data rate applications. Okay, so our takeaways really are, one, that we think this passive service, and this goes beyond the 95 to 275, this issue of coexistence with passive services is going to be a long-term, complicated discussion. So we'd recommend the Commission take an active role in opening up that conversation. It's going to involve probably multiple federal users and the commercial side. And then to the second part, the Commission needs to stay on top of this balance of what are we going to do above 95 gigahertz. There is a proceeding, so we need to monitor progress in this area and look at petitions. Here's our required workshop, Dennis, so we get our one of 12. And it's not entirely in jest. It's not clear. There's a lot going on, but it's not clear whether these are, as Adam would call them, jewelry. They're sort of one-of-a-kind, really specialized radios, or how close to high-volume commercialization some of these things are. Then there's the international activity. Where do we fit with respect to the rest of the world in developments? Okay, terahertz. Just 2 more slides. So terahertz is an interesting area. The first few bullets just have to do with what we see going on there. I think if there's a takeaway for us, I'd say it's not necessarily about communications technologies. In fact, to me, it's mostly not about communications. There's all sorts of other things going on there. So the research can be, some of it's very fundamental. How do you generate terahertz? These are sources and detectors. How do you detect it? Then there's a bunch of stuff on materials research, on imaging, security, scanning things. There's biomedical, there's DNA research, it's such a huge range of work going on there. You can watch it. There is one other, just to sort of round it out, give you the balanced view, because you see a lot of, terahertz is going to solve all sorts of problems. That may be true. There's an interesting article from a couple years ago in Spectrum about why it's non-trivial to do this stuff. Okay, lastly, so this is another area that we think can be monitored. There are no obvious problems. We've talked to the IEEE about their terahertz, their 802 terahertz group. So nobody's knocking on anybody's door saying we have a regulatory issue right now. I think the second bullet I've already stated, we're going to need to watch for lots of non-communications kind of applications. So, active emitters and on the other side detectors, but not necessarily for moving data around. Then, last bullet is same thing we ran into with 95 to 275, only it's much higher. You have the same issue. There's lots of passive allocations. So, because these are physics driven, the passive sort of the earth science people, they can look ahead and they say we need to be listening here and here and here, and so there's claims all the way through, well up into terahertz span. So I think that's it.
Any questions for the working group? Put those tent cards up. Anyone from the phone lines? Such an exquisite presentation. So completely clear that you've totally illuminated the future in Spectrum, and we're off and running. All right. I seriously don't see anyone else, so right on schedule, direct from the airport. Shahid has arrived to provide his presentation. Thank you for your efforts to be here and your timeliness. We did actually organize things with this slot in mind, given the knowledge of your travel.
I appreciate that, and thanks to FCC, made my at least my in-flight experience with Wi-Fi, very productive. So now you need to work on getting the crew on time. I know you guys have been busy with in-flight experience, so it's been a great achievement.
Shahid, one other comment. We're running a little bit late.
Okay.
So in your presentation, it's back-end loaded in terms of information. So if you could accelerate through the... Yes.
Got it. Thank you. All right, so I'll just go off these slides then. Mm-hmm. Today we're talking about COTS. I won't get into the objectives. We've got a very large team, as you can tell. Great contribution from everyone in regards to what COTS means and how we can leverage it in the marketplace. So if we go to the next slide, please. Again, I'm not going to get into the mission statement. But essentially, we were looking to find ways to leverage existing common platforms to generate more wireless applications and uses in the marketplace, lower the cost of entry, accelerate different applications. Moving on to the next slide. Again, we followed a process that we had leveraged previously, essentially talking to the overall ecosystem and really interviewing and getting their requirements as far as what they think are some of the drivers, inhibitors around COTS. So we spoke to a really nice cross-sectional vertical group, everybody from Department of Transportation through Ford, utility companies, and so it was a really nice cross-sectional overview of what the requirements are for this kind of platform. We're at the end of the road here. We're coming up with 3 different recommendations. We'll move on to those, please, Walter. The first one is really a recommendation for the FCC to take action upon. It's really around coming up with a robust definition around what is COTS and putting that framework in front of these various verticals who are either A, building their own networks and leveraging a variety of different technologies, and B, really explaining the benefits of common platforms that could be leveraged out in the marketplace. From an economic standpoint, the market, one can argue, is very overcapitalized from a network infrastructure perspective. If you view what's happening in the enterprise side, especially with the advent of voice over IP technologies, almost every large enterprise is leveraging SIP technology over IP. And if you could take that example and apply that to other applications such as smart grid, metering, other transportation telemetry uses, I think the same architectural framework could be leveraged. And so I think there is a real need for somebody to come up with that COTS framework and then be able to explain where different resources are that could be leveraged as a common platform. So I think that's one recommendation we're putting forward. The second recommendation, and I understand other groups and a variety of different forums have looked into spectrum sharing. But again, if you look at COTS, it ranges everything from power generation, power supply, power demand, all the way up through the stack to software. And if you think about what's happening in the software layer, especially in the context of SDN and NFV, you could easily see a platform through which, not only in the core you could have a common platform from a network standpoint, but also in the physical side from a spectrum point of view, you could see a lot of uses. And I think things like SDN and NFV is only going to help enable the use of spectrum efficiency and spectrum sharing. So I think the stars are aligning towards this whole paradigm shift of really leveraging and sharing spectrum, and I think this is something the group ought to take a look more closely. Next slide. Finally, we also recommend that we hold a workshop, a very collaborative workshop with a variety of different vertical players, particularly those who are building their own networks, and leveraging not only just spectrum resources, but also other networking resources in the marketplace. I think there is a real need for somebody to step up like FCC to bring all of these, a variety of different groups together and really gain some consensus as to how these technologies could be leveraged to enable a common platform. So I think that would be a very useful exercise. Something could be done very quickly in a short order. We don't believe that's going to take a lot of effort, and I think a lot of groups are already beginning to look at this in different conferences and a variety of different workshops. So we recommend that FCC take the leadership role here and bring a variety of these groups together. Next slide, please. So, real quick, in terms of who are these groups, obviously, there are a number of different places and verticals where common platforms could be leveraged. Obviously, in the DoD space, public safety space, and equally in the utility space, there's definitely a opportunity for leveraging common platforms. And so this is just an example of verticals that we think common platforms could be leveraged. We've got a whole Excel spreadsheet full of use cases that describes not only just the vertical, but the actual application within those use cases. I won't get into detail, but those have been documented for this group. Next slide, please. All right, I think I'm my last slide. Hopefully I'm giving some time back to this
you've
group.
done extremely well.
I'll take more questions, but again, the next steps is really to act upon those three recommendations. I don't believe that's going to take a lot of effort. It's a matter of getting the right people and the right groups together and getting it done. And then finally, providing those results through this workshop, putting a proposal in front of these verticals to suggest what a COTS framework may look like, its potential uses, its economic benefits. I think we need to really demonstrate those opportunities to this group and bring some consensus. And that's really it. I'll take questions. I know I probably took less than 10 minutes.
Yeah, no, you were. Everyone else has been a bit over, but you made up for everybody else.
Okay.
So. Well done. Are there questions? Please, Peter.
So, Shahid, I know you're so global in your perspective, but one of the questions I have, I know with GPS, for instance, with the Russians and the Chinese building out their own GPS constellation with their own receivers, how do we in the U.S. in this area and the TAC kind of coordinate with what's happening outside the U.S. where basically they have sort of zero interest in what our licensing restrictions are going to be around the use of their technology? They're just moving forward without us.
That's a great question. We did look at a different set of standards and policies outside of U.S., and to be honest with you, it was all over the place, to be quite frank. So kind of very quickly gave up on kind of bringing a common requirement. But I think it's a good idea that we ought to look at certain countries, perhaps regions. I know even though in Europe it is considered to be fairly standardized across different European Union countries, but the implementation is very fragmented. At least that's how we observed. But yeah, we could take a look at that. Absolutely.
Might be time for a TAC field trip.
Russia in February?
Yeah. Have you seen the weather? Yeah.
Now, Peter, we do appreciate your volunteering to host the group for a field trip, so we'll graciously accept.
In Brooklyn.
Greg has a question.
Yeah. Greg.
Shahid, I'm more interested in your suggestion about spectrum sharing using COTS. And are you suggesting that if different groups use the same hardware, that they could arrange a system where they could share spectrum going back and forth with it?
I think so. I mean, I think we have to kind of figure out what that governance model will look like, what the applications are. But stealing example out of the whole white space application, I think that's a very important development, and clearly being implemented in UK right now, and in various different stages. But I think that's something we have to look at. Again, as I mentioned, the software side is really enabling the whole idea of sharing spectrum, and I think we ought to take a look at it more closely. I could be whispering this to you, by the way.
Walter, go ahead.
Just a final comment on that. In a lot of our interviews, we found that companies that have that deal in field support, plant structure, or otherwise have applications out of the normal commercial domains, they basically argue we build our own network where there's no other network available. And they made the observation, that it would be interesting opportune to use COTS technology for cost savings and also benefits in terms of common handsets, multimedia capability. So there is this issue of areas that are not well commercialized. If you want to support a COTS strategy, the implication there is use of the spectrum that COTS implies. So we thought it was an interesting opportunity to look at, and certainly one that kept coming back to us in interview discussions across multiple segments.
I like it.
Yeah, this has entered a much broader topic of sharing, especially in the rural areas where a lot of the spectrum really is available.
It saves you from all that standard stuff we're working on.
Well, hopefully it is all standards. Are there any questions or comments from those of you on the teleconference lines? One of the technologies we're going to have to get is virtual tent cards so that we can see you all out there as you have your questions.
We do have a hand-raising tool.
Well, yeah, we'll have to deploy that.
We all have our webcams ready.
Okay, very good. Yeah, we'll give that to Walter as one of the to-dos to work this up so that we can get a wall of screens so that we can see each of you. And
the real challenge is sometimes webcams catch you at unexpected moments. I would caution people about that.
Just so you know, the FCC laptop is...
Well, that's the whole point. It keeps us disciplined.
Okay, let's move on then to our cloud security, from whimsical webcams to cloud security. Very, very important topic, and in fact one that our chairman is extremely interested in, as I've seen from the communications with him, and more than just our chairman even. This is a very, very hot topic. We have had an interesting one as to speakers. Once we put the slide up, you will see a set of names. Paul Steinberg is the chair. Paul was not able to be with us. Adam Drobot attempted to be with us and got all the way to Charlotte before his travels were curtailed. So we have a lineup ready to present, and we actually have 4 presenters, I think, and Mike McNamara is going to be the lead-off and the introduction.
This is certainly the most complex presentation.
Yes, with 4 presenters, this is, I think, the security aspect, we're keeping it very secure in terms of compartmentalized knowledge. Each speaker only can speak to his piece.
Spread spectrum.
Yes. So, take it away.
Thank you. I appreciate it. On behalf of, as you said, Paul, Adam, and also George Popovich from Motorola was supposed to be here to, certainly lead this presentation. We appreciate everybody's understanding in a very dynamic presentation here regarding communications infrastructure security. If I could have the mission statement brought up, certainly won't go through this, but as we've all heard and talked about, we are all moving to broadband IP communications at a much faster rate or a much accelerating rate. And certainly security is at the top of everybody's mind, or at least should be. And certainly in an era where, as it says, consumers and businesses rely upon every dime that they can save outsourcing to cloud, to look at applications, way of hosting applications, way of hosting storage, way of communicating with their customers. Security is of utmost importance. And so, cloud infrastructure, how should the cloud infrastructure and service providers look at the issue of security to best determine how do we protect the information it is that we're creating, and how do we protect the consumers for either critical or, as you move up the critical spectrum, more critical, how do you protect that in the most secure way? If I could ask you to move on to the next slide. Once again, this working group has been a fantastic aggregation of talent led by those on the left, and I'll not go through it, as I already talked about our chair, our vice chair, and everybody that has been contributing to the areas. On the next slide, as we started off the working group, we looked at three areas back at the beginning of the TAC: consumer enterprise, critical infrastructure, and network access. And as we moved into the September TAC meeting and brought a series of gaps forward, we decided that the best way to come in front of all of you today was to look at not only the gaps, but really evolve that into areas of focus that we zeroed in on, and then eventually, as we'll get to at the end, recommendations that, should the TAC continue in 2014, that should be explored further in the area of communications infrastructure security. And so as we move on to slide number 5, really just recapping what I said is, the final TAC recommendations, looking at all of the specific areas that we'll get into in here in just about 2 slides. So moving on to slide 6, those 3 areas that I just talked about a couple slides ago, we boiled that into 5 areas of focus: education, accountability, industry collaboration, and then the last 2, certification and auditing. We found a natural fit of bringing those 2 areas together to really combine it down into 4. So for the first one on education, I will turn it over to Lynn Merrill.
Thank you, Mike. So, Walter, if you want to just turn back to the education awareness and recommendations as far as where that is.
You want to go forward or back?
You're going to go 3 slides forward.
Right?
Yeah, the mic's not on. There you go. Okay, thank you. Okay. So what I'm going to cover as far as just looking at it from an education standpoint, it's really the cornerstone as far as to gain the acceptance of the cloud user and to also expand the user's knowledge base and to help them understand ways to go ahead and protect their network. Now, when we think of our takeaways as far as what we're looking at, one of the things is when we're developing items and going ahead and listing them that we want to do is we want to be very specific as far as for some of the items that we're looking at and we're going to receive. So make sure when we're developing things that we target our audience as far as what the takeaways are going to be. And also we need to go ahead and define as far as who is supposed to receive them, because we have a wide range of information that we're collecting and that we're using, and we need to go ahead and make sure that if we're developing anything that we go ahead and bring it down to a specific need as far as for an individual group or an individual area, which would in a sense be the target factor as far as for your awareness. Now, one element that we were just going to talk about here was the small enterprise users. The small enterprise users, as far as with 5 or less IT staff as far as in their organizations, have a unique situation where they probably don't have someone that can go ahead and handle just the security as a whole. They don't have time to go ahead and to administer things, to go out and look and see this broadband of information that's available. So what we're trying to do is go ahead and say that these users, if you go ahead and target and present information that would be directly to them, would be some that could go ahead and glean information and be able to use it and to and have a great awareness campaign to where they can go ahead and move forward and implement security information as far as within their network and also for the cloud. So one of the things we were looking at as far as from a near term is for the FCC, in a sense, to collaborate with NIST and other government agencies, academic, also industry associations, to better identify material from public resources that we can use as far as in maybe developing some sort of reference guide. The FCC should consider either doing it themselves or through the industry help to go ahead and develop something that can be used as far as from a web base that would have links back to the original information, but also would have specific information in a sense in a user guide format or a user case format to where these folks could look at it, pick up the information, and immediately be able to work with it. This material really needs to be evangelized, because if you put it out there and you don't go ahead and try to get it out there to the end users, it's not going to be able to be very effective and do much. So we're really looking at the FCC needs to determine ways to go ahead and get the information out there and select particular technology folks and even marketing folks to help determine where this needs to go. And this is just kind of in the near term. Honestly, there's not that much investment that has to go into this. You're really looking at using labor from internal or from external sources to go ahead and help develop this, but there's no cash outlay. And the materials could be developed or put on the FCC's website or other websites that would be easy for folks to go ahead and reference. If we go ahead and switch to the next page, we'll talk a little bit about the long-term goals. When you look a little bit longer, you have to go ahead and look at identifying gaps as far as for education and awareness materials, as far as throughout the whole area, whether you're talking about the cloud carriers or focusing in directly on the security items themselves. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done as far as in these areas, which would be topics such as carrier security routing, DNS. And the other thing that we're going to see as the rest of our group goes ahead and talks as far as from the security working group, infrastructure working group, is that a lot of these things will be timely, that can be just incorporated into this as those items are developed. Making an awareness as far as for public awareness, the FCC has the ability to go ahead and develop liaisons as far as with other agencies, and for them to go ahead and link websites or link individual informations as far as that can be disseminated out to individual end users or users as far as from those particular government agencies. You could talk about folks like SBA, Rural Utility Services as far as under USDA, the TIA as far as in grants, as far as cloud providers, industry associations. Look at the smart communities as far as any associations on those, and the broadband providers themselves. One of the things that the FCC does have the capability to do is to go ahead and ask or work with the broadband providers and any of the cloud providers that fall under their purview to go ahead and place information or to direct their users as far as to the information on any website that's listed. Now, for the rest of the communication infrastructure working group, you're going to go ahead and be able to see the common thread as far as when you think of education, how that shows up, whether you look at as far as from accountability, the industry collaboration, or the certification audit. When we developed this, it was hard for us to go ahead and not develop an overlap between what we were talking about on education and what was listing as far as in the examples and recommendations from each of the groups. So really I'm going to stop here, just use this as a precursor to go ahead and set the stage for the rest of the group. So the next subgroup is going to be the accountability. And Mike, I'll turn that back to you.
Thanks, Lynn. So as we, if I could ask you to advance the slide, and talking about accountability. Accountability certainly has been the main focus, as I talked about in the intro. It has been the main focus of our working group, and really what we're looking for. We had great advisory.
Can we have the slides, please?
It's already up. Oh, sorry. There we go. On the working group, we did have an advisor from the Cloud Security Alliance, John Howie. And really, the CSA has broken down the responsibilities when looking at each party, cloud consumer, cloud provider, the cloud carrier, and also the cloud auditor across different service models. But as we look across those service models, we need to ensure that there are protection mechanisms across each. Certification and auditing, as we'll talk about here in a minute, is definitely critical, but accountability, as we saw in our activities pre the September meeting, accountability definitely is lacking, or it is really subject to interpretation. And certainly, as we'll talk about here in a minute, the larger the consumer is to be able to outsource and to be able to negotiate certain agreements, the more power that they have. But there's given concern there when you talk about small IT shops that really don't have significant IT expertise, and looking at who should be accountable. They clearly are looking at the cloud providers or the cloud carrier as the most knowledgeable in the stack of who should be providing what type of security. If we could go on to the next slide. There certainly are, as Lynn was saying, there's quite a bit of education out there when we look at best practices. A number from NIST and the different agencies, as I mentioned, the Cloud Security Alliance, that really do highlight best practices. When talking about the current landscapes, as we see on the slide in front of us, knowledge or understanding is limited when we look at who is accountable for what portion of security. The lines are definitely unclear, and as we continue to move more and more to the cloud, whether you're looking at sending your information over the top, over common internet access, or purchasing dedicated lines or some sort of dedicated Ethernet service, all of these in some form are subject to, as we've talked about, DNS spoofing, BGP hacking, or just commonly known as man-in-the-middle attacks. Certainly, there are data protection parameters that do exist for areas such as PCI, HIPAA compliance, but once again, those are focused on specific data or specific industry types. As I previously mentioned, in the areas of auditing and SLAs, or service level agreements, there's many challenges that have been documented that have come from the cloud provider's ability to be able to service all customers in a common way. And as I previously noted, certainly the larger that the consumer is, the more power that they have because of the monthly recurring revenue to be able to negotiate a stronger service level agreement and drive more accountability into the agreement to protect not only themselves but the cloud consumer. And then lastly, in the area of business continuance and disaster recovery, certainly outsourcing to the cloud does create a false sense of security, as we found during our discussions with outside industry experts from the hardware, the software, service provider, and cloud provider companies. Moving on to the recommendation slide. Obviously, general takeaways that we see, clearly, security is strongest as the weakest link. That pretty much goes without saying. But when you look at the end-to-end number of actors in an ecosystem, from a cloud consumer all the way through a cloud provider, anybody that is not doing their job or not having their job or the requirements well defined, typically you're asking for problems. As we move down into the short-term recommendations, as Lynn talked about, education, always the most important. But, there needs to be easy to access, easy to understand requirements or guidelines to make cloud consumers aware of clearly the problems, who has accountability, and the best way to achieve accountability. In long-term recommendations, we suggest creating a study on specific recommendations that may need to be developed around critical infrastructure cloud services. Extend the scope of accountability beyond security to other areas such as availability and performance of the service that the consumer is buying. And then also study the impact, as the gentleman from Accenture mentioned, study the impacts of SDN and NFV on cloud security. And as we continue to have software defining more of the communications infrastructure, and we're virtualizing more of the communications infrastructure, that will bring on a new set of security challenges that we need to be aware of and need to address as we move forward. I'll turn this over to talk about industry collaboration to David and Donald.
I'll jump in. Thank you very much, Mike and Lynn and the whole team. I'm Donald Ty with Verizon, and so was participating in this working group. So we'll start with the next slide and just touch obviously on the big picture. In some ways, the industry collaboration that we reviewed throughout the year and over these past 3 months since the September meeting really are the conduit or the mechanism for some of these education and awareness aspects that we've been talking about throughout the entire day, as well as throughout this entire working group's presentation. Stats vary, but 95% of the nation's critical infrastructure and the cloud infrastructure are owned and operated by the private sector. And so they're the means for ensuring information's availability and security and integrity. And that's really the perspective that we were looking at. We discovered in our analysis really a model of three different aspects of industry collaboration. Industry to industry collaboration, industry gathered, industry led, self-managed, industry sponsored or industry organized collaboration that is functionally focused on funneling input, feedback, interaction with government entities, and then government sponsored entities for industry feedback, of which obviously the TAC is a specific and successful example of. Next slide, please. And as we look at much of the innovation and leadership that the federal government has brought to bear on these subjects like cloud security and resiliency, we see in each of the examples, we just took a cut at about a 6-year window, that in each of these innovations, it's government that was manifesting the innovation or implementing it both in the marketplace and for government. Certainly the establishment in the recent years of our first CIO federally, first CTO, the initiatives towards cloud, migration to the cloud by the government, which has obviously plays a role in leading what private sector sees and helping add some transparency and illumination onto these issues of security. Next slide, please. Just to surface a couple examples of how each of these three different models of industry collaboration play out. Two for industry to industry collaboration of many. The Information Technology Industry Council, which is a convening mechanism for industry enterprises that provides a bridge to government. Tech America, another one, sort of trying to harness innovation and promote it, support it, both policy-wise and communications-wise. On the industry-sponsored collaboration that funnels feedback and input and interaction with federal government, the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers are one example. The sector coordinating councils across each of the different sectors of critical infrastructure around our country are examples that are active in the cloud and information technology field. And then much, as I mentioned, like the TAC, the government-sponsored mechanisms for industry collaboration and cooperation and interaction, and other agencies obviously also have advisory panels. The executive branch with things like the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Council, the NSTAC. And another example in this part of the model is the NIST-led cybersecurity framework, which obviously has been a powerful means for industry collaboration and interaction with government over this past year since last February's executive order. Next slide, please. So we see in bullet 2 and 3 here two short-term recommendations that our group came up with. One is, and they really sort of bring to life the education and awareness aspects that we've been talking about. Incorporate some of these toolkits of cloud security standards, processes, best practices into the 2014 calendar of already planned FCC events. And secondly, perhaps consider convening a workshop that bridges the public sector and the private sector, where, especially moving down into medium and small enterprise sides where there might not have the insight into some of these standards and mechanisms for information access and security. The final two bullets are something that we recommend be considered by the TAC and the FCC during 2014 to perhaps for longer-term recommendations, including formalizing some partnerships with the FCC and some of the other entities in the federal government that have formal jurisdiction and oversight of some of these issues. Obviously, Homeland Security is tasked with securing the critical infrastructure. OMB, NIST, obviously, with the cybersecurity framework, and there's a role in partnership for the FCC to play in those. And then finally, the FCC has a unique set of stakeholders in both public and private sectors that it works with, and perhaps the establishment of an FCC-sponsored clean room or mechanism for information sharing of some of these standards, concerns, and solutions, something that should be looked at further. So with that, I'll pass it on to our certification and auditing team. Thank you very much, Peter.
When we can we move on to the next slide? When we reviewed certification and audit models in the cloud, we found two general approaches that were widely used by cloud service providers. Although not universal, many CSPs are performing either self-assessments of their operational and security controls or are undergoing third-party assessments using generally accepted standards and audit principles. These programs are designed to promote trust in the cloud by providing transparency, simplifying operations, and promoting consistency. Although there are many certification programs in use by CSPs today, many are new. They continue to evolve. They're somewhat complex for small and medium-sized businesses to absorb, and they don't meet all of the use cases that we have defined in the cloud space. So moving on to the next slide. We talked a little bit about the CSA STAR program, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, or AICPA's SOC 2 program. Those are the two most sought after by enterprises, and many cloud service providers develop and use them today. CSPs who want to do business with the federal government must comply with FedRAMP, and CSPs must complete an audit and obtain an authority to operate before doing business with the federal government and in the cloud service arena. NIST has a number of standards, and we talked a little bit about the cybersecurity framework for critical infrastructure providers, but in certain sectors, they're already using NERC CIP or NIST IR 7628, both of which are not used in the cloud, and there's not an easy certification or audit framework available for those folks. Finally, law enforcement agencies can use IACP's guiding principles in cloud computing to help with their analysis, but there's no certification framework in place for them. Moving on to the next slide, when we talk a little bit about the landscape, we've talked a little bit about NIST and SOC 2 and CSA STAR. Again, these are generally rigorous and somewhat complex. And if you're a large company delivering cloud services, it's much easier for you to get these types of certifications. It's a little bit more of a hurdle for a lot of small to medium-sized companies. A lot of federal agencies are using FedRAMP today, but local and state governments, there is no certification audit framework that we could find like FedRAMP for federal and, state and local agencies. A lot of folks, even in the criminal justice world, would like to see something when we start looking at mission critical and critical infrastructure. CGIS data is if there could be a certification for the law enforcement community, local, state level, a lot of folks would be interested in that. And then when we start talking about industrial control systems, SCADA data, they're not likely, at least doesn't appear, to move as quickly into the cloud as most enterprises do because of the inherent risks of moving to cloud services today. Moving on to the next slide, some general takeaways from our recommendations. As we mentioned, there are a lot of certification models out there today. They all don't, there is no one size fits all. If you're an enterprise or you're in the federal or local governments, although some of the security requirements overlap, they're not all the same in the certification and audit models. If we could move down to the recommendation slide, a couple slides down. Thank you. So again, one size does not fit all. There are a number of overlaps, as we mentioned, so some of the certification frameworks that are available today could be great foundations to help where there are gaps, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of those recommendations. And then we think there's a role, as we mentioned before, with the FCC to collaborate in public-private partnerships and work with folks like the CSA who've done a tremendous amount of work in the space and have got a tremendous head start to collaborate and develop certification and audit schemes that we think might go beyond where they are today. Moving on to the next slide, some of the short-term recommendations. We talk about smaller, medium-sized enterprises. Again, you might be partnering, you might decide to partner with a cloud service provider who might have a certification and audit program. But very often we're recommending that the FCC also explore a workshop, a public-private workshop, to help develop educational and awareness materials to help certify applications before they move in the cloud or make sure they stay secure once they've moved to the cloud. There's a shared services model today that a lot of folks, especially in the small and medium-sized business world, that is underserviced, and there could be some educational materials and certification and audit mechanisms that can help to promote awareness in that area. We also recommend that the FCC leverage some of the existing standards for certification like NIST, the AICPA SOC 2, ISO 27001, FedRAMP, and the CSA Open Certification Framework in developing educational and awareness materials and certification audit schemes and helping to evolve the conversation and evolve those particular frameworks over time. If we move to the next slide for long-term recommendations, we talked a little bit about the collaboration with organizations like CSA. As cloud security evolves, we think there's a role with the FCC to continue to collaborate with organizations like the CSA. We also believe that the FCC could have a role in helping to expand FedRAMP in the criminal justice community and also help what we consider to be high impact data coverage. That's critical infrastructure, SCADA data, that sort of thing. And then there's also a lot of regulatory work today in organizations like NERC. We think the FCC should also help collaborate and help evolve the discussion around some of the federal agencies that are already working in security in that critical infrastructure organization. So, Mike, do you want to close this out?
You bet. And for our last slide, just bringing this back, conclusions and next steps. Clearly, as we've talked about, with broadband IP, moving more to an outsourced model for consumers, moving more of their IT-like functions is happening at an accelerating rate, and with this, the security aspects of communications really people tend to move quicker in some instances than really security will allow, and so. As we look at this, security and resiliency, both of these, as we continue to virtualize more of our communications infrastructure, looking at how to keep that secure, how to keep it highly available, and we need to, or we're asking the FCC to consider, the implications of cloud computing, and how. How this will have effect on consumers, on the protection of information, on the protection of the security of all consumers. And as we move into 2014, as we look at suggested TAC activities, clearly we would suggest including cloud resilience, availability, and performance as deeper areas of focus. Additional security analysis around the critical infrastructure and the usage of the cloud. And, as Pete was outlining, help the FCC create alliances, joint forums, industries, workshops, and then lastly, as Lynn pointed out, the organization, the cataloging of the vast amount of information that is out there on the cloud, and the best way to go about continuing moving towards cloud communications and the security of the information contained within. Certainly open it up for any questions.
John Chapin, go ahead.
Yes, from the perspective of the individual consumer, they're already obviously trusting an awful lot of their critical data to their smartphone. And, the exact same issues that you're talking about with regard to moving computation into the cloud are already in place. So let me ask the two tough questions. One is, should the FCC have a role in improving the certification and auditing of the security of the phones themselves? And secondly, even if it does not, should it at least have a role in protecting the lower levels of those phones as they become more software defined? Their non-interference properties depend on their security, and that's something that's well within the FCC's existing mandate. Do you see, has your group talked about that at all, or could it talk about that in the future?
We certainly talked about, we didn't stop just at smartphones, but you ask a great question, because as you look at smartphones, tablets, personal devices, and more consumers are using their devices not only for personal use but for work use. So I completely agree with your question. I would just say we shouldn't stop at just smartphones. We should look at mobility as a much larger type of problem, and as consumers are using devices for multiple purposes, I think we definitely should look deeper at exactly what you're saying.
Great. Shahid.
My question is around the same line, which is, as we all know, there are a number of different app providers leveraging the cloud infrastructure today. Everybody from the guy who offers the garage opener on your smartphone, through Uber, through a number of different home-connected device applications. So the question is, do some of the security certifications that you talked about apply to those app providers, and where do they store my garage opening habits, right? And I'm looking at this from my consumer protection perspective, right? And all the other things I do at home, I don't know when I download an app where that data is going to go. I like the app, and it provides a certain utility to me, but it's scary to know what happens to that data somewhere. So, did your group look into that?
We did. One of the things that we found is that you might have an application provider, you mentioned a couple, that partners with a certified cloud services provider. That doesn't necessarily mean that app is secure, right? Because you're talking about a lot of data that might be in the charge of that application provider, and they're relying on some of the security that the cloud service provider provides, but it's not 100%, it's not comprehensive. So one of the recommendations that we looked into was really being clear about how do you move an application in the cloud securely. Once it's in there, how do we continue to make it secure? And we're recommending, obviously, certainly the more secure those applications are, the cleaner our networks will be, the more stable our critical infrastructure will be, and we think that the better protected our consumer privacy data will be as well.
Peter.
Shahid, to follow on, I think no one in this room needs to have the issue of accountability that was raised. I mean, we all get it, but the consumer doesn't. And I think we're moving into an environment of increasing lack of accountability. And everyone in this room represents many represent organizations that if there's a failure, the Bright House customer is going to first ask, well, why didn't Bright House protect me? And Bright House is going to wait, that wasn't our responsibility. We just transported this security breach along our network. And then the cloud provider said, well, it's not ours. We just stored the security breach. And the app developer said, well, it's not our fault because someone injected the security breach. And I think that the real issue, back to both questions about the FCC and your question, Shahid, is, the one place at the FCC might have a role is in the assignment of accountability on some of these issues, because for the consumer otherwise it's really going to be an increasingly frustrating and dangerous environment for them to really know how to operate in it. So I think that's really one of the, and it's a tough issue, we all get it, but I think it's really at the core, this issue of accountability and lack of it is at the core of a lot of the recommendations that the group made.
Kevin?
Yeah, I had both a comment that goes back to John's question as well as a sort of a question. In last year's TAC, we had a security work group that was focused on mobile devices, and there were a number of different recommendations, many of them actually in common with the cloud recommendations here. One of the recommendations also that we had was the idea of the FCC trying to foster a kind of a security branding type of thing, something that would be visible to consumers. It'd probably need to be multiple levels, but some kind of consumer branding, and that would define a certain level of security that would have to achieve, and that might ratchet up over the years as the arms race continues, right, for security. But so the question part of that, I guess, is did the cloud security work group look at any sort of branding techniques as a component of consumer education?
Glenn?
Kind of a branded,
yeah, I can.
Good housekeeping seal of approval type of.
I would say not specifically. Certainly, looking at best practices from organizations like the Cloud Security Alliance, we took a lot of our lead from them, but not specifically what you're suggesting. We did not look at that.
Okay.
There are a number of private. What we found is a lot of in the industry today. A lot of what we saw today on the consumer side, the focus on privacy, and there are some existing FTC plays a lot in the privacy world today, and there's also a trustee certification that we highlighted in our white paper, which is a commercial certification that small companies can get, develop a privacy program, and make sure that they implement the operational controls. And so you're seeing that more and more throughout the industry. People want to do something about privacy. Many small to medium-sized businesses can't afford gigantic programs, and so that's one way to get started. So we did highlight that a little bit in our white paper, but we didn't dive down deep into the FCC promoting some additional consumer-based kind of privacy seals or certifications. But it's something to consider for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think that there is certainly a caveat emptor, a buyer beware scenario here from the consumer's point of view, without doubt. I think for that reason alone, it strikes us that cloud computing has become so pervasive, everybody's standing up a cloud to do something. And there should be regulatory guidelines for security, expected minimum levels of security, that the FCC should consider figuring out how to put out as a specification. The challenge otherwise is that consumers are downloading these applications all the time, and that data is absolutely going everywhere. And unless there's some sort of minimum expectation of what we should set as a standard, we're going to have a big issue with this. It's a significant problem.
Surely this is a very big area, as we've seen in the presentation. We are running out of time, so if you could make your last comments. I think, Jesse, you had your card up first. So,
At the risk of piling on, I think this whole issue of cloud security, if you take a look at what's happening in the automobile industry, we're actually turning the automobile into people by using your cell phones to control them. I mean, this is a very, very serious issue that I think we need to start to take a holistic look at creating something like a cloud brokering service, right, to protect some of the people that are using these systems, right, because of the potential dangerous impact that it could have with the number of different types of applications controlling many different things. And I don't want to pick on automobiles, but that's just one example that I think starts to get into a very serious ring.
Your last question.
Yeah, so during the discussion, we did discuss a kind of range of actions all the way from education, certification, reporting, compliance, enforcement, but we thought that low-hanging fruit is really education and certification. That's why we settled on those two make the consumer aware before he puts an application to the cloud, fully aware whether it meets the business need. What are the challenges he has to be able to, not only externally but also internally, organizationally, he has to be able to handle this. So we thought that the low-hanging fruit for improving this is this bottom two layers of the gamut of action we can take: so education, certification.
Being in the education field is still a very big area, and certification, we've had some conversations, is also a large task. We can keep a lot of people at FCC employed in certification if we go down that path very, very far. But nonetheless, there were good points. Russ is...
So a couple of quick points. One, I think we need to be careful not to hurt innovation in this space by slapping on regulations where we don't need them. And the second part of that is it's a global issue, really. I think to the first point, if we put regulations in place too deep, we could just force all the clouds and data centers to be outside the U.S. where they're free to do what they want. So I think it's not a black and white issue, and it needs to be thought of, I think, in depth. I'd like to see in the recommendations something more in a global perspective of how we're working with other governments. If we come up with a label, it's kind of useless if it's only in the United States. By the way, in your cyber studies, do you have any reporting on where most of the attacks are coming from? Or do we not want to know?
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I know David, he left, but he left me with some recommendations for possible TAC topics that I think he sent Dennis to you and Walter.
We got them, and we're going to cover that in a different way. In just a moment.
One of them, though, happened to tie into what Russ was just saying. It was about sustaining and building global trust in the internet infrastructure.
Yes. Yeah. We were just that
was very good. Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting one.
Yeah.
Okay, we have come close to the end of our time, so I want to be relatively close, at least to our closing time. And for that purpose, I'd like to give Julie the opportunity to respond on behalf of FCC on the things he's seen today.
Should only be 15 minutes.
Okay.
So.
We'll work on negative time.
No, I just want to thank everybody for all of your work and the thoughtfulness that went into the recommendations that we've got. I thought it was a very rich set of ideas that were presented through this cycle. We have been committed all along to taking the recommendations and turning them into actions. And so that's what we'll be planning to do. We've given some thought to a number of these things and already and starting to map into time frames when we think we might do certain things. I think we'll have 12 days in a row of workshops.
I recount them. I only count up to 10. So whoever said 12, you were exaggerating.
12 days of Christmas. You got to consider, like running a workshop on how to run workshops. You guys are the world expert on it.
But I thank you for all the work you've done, and especially for coming out when the travel was not so terrific. And for the people who weren't able to make it, and I know many of them made efforts, thank them for participating on the phone as well. And do you want to talk a little bit about the plan from here?
I'm going to turn it over to Walter, and then we'll talk about the plan from here.
Could you put up the slide again? All right. I want to do this very quickly. Those were tentative dates for next year's meeting. A suggestion was made by several people that we try to keep away from Mondays. By the way, Mondays, if you haven't guessed, are in red. And if there's a consensus on that, I'd be happy to try to do that. I'm not sure what flexibility we have in March. But I would try to, if everybody's happy with the approximate week, unless we try to look at this thing in terms of where we were last year, what conventions we're up against, religious holidays. So we've done the obvious things, but maybe there's a world conference planned on something that we don't know about. But those are the dates. Could I have a show of hands on Mondays are bad? Are Fridays equally bad? All right. So that okay.
Don't ask about the other.
That's as far as that was going to go.
Well, I think it's the West Coast guys.
Right.
That
That's
have a problem
correct.
with Monday.
That's correct.
I think it's the
Just
location.
lost Sunday.
Somewhere in the Caribbean.
Okay. So I'll try to work away from Mondays and away from Fridays. We had planned to discuss this today, and we just won't have time. Potential future work items. If you looked at your handouts, you received a handout on a preliminary list. It's already provoked some feedback, which is what we wanted. If you send me suggestions for what you think we ought to be working on, look at the list first, but I will circulate and distribute anything that's sent to me, and we are going to plan. Well, it gives us an opportunity to talk to the chairman in the meantime, and we will plan to have a teleconference second or third week of January on this subject to close out, and then we'll start soliciting volunteers for other work groups based upon that proposal. Like Julie said, I'd like to thank everybody. I know this was not an optimum travel time. We're amazed, frankly, that as many people showed up as did for this meeting. And other than that, one other thing, we tried something, not by choice, but by necessity of using AT&T Connect service, WebEx type offering. For those of you on the phone, if you found that useful, we know what doesn't work now, having run through it, and can do it much more smoothly the next time. But I know we've had lots of complaints about the audio conference as being very not a great tool for participating in these meetings. We'd be happy to instantiate something like this going forward. So other than that, I think that's about it. Other than, again, thanks. And Dennis, you have final.
Walter, did you put those preliminary dates out on an email or something?
No, I've been restrained from doing that. This is the first peek you've had at those dates.
Well, then while he's talking, could you put them back up just so that we can?
I'll even mail them to you.
That'd be good too.
If we could have them put back on the screen. Julie, go ahead.
Yeah, and we're just about at the close. I know many of you heard this, but just for everybody and for everybody in the audience. So one of the early actions of Chairman Wheeler was to remove the acting from Dennis Roberson's title. So Dennis is our official chairman from here on out.
Congratulations. Congratulations and condolences.
Yeah, well, I have to share because it will be forever emblazoned in my mind. And Julie's already laughing. At the end of the meeting, we had a meeting to talk about what we'd done with his TAC while he was off. Yeah, the chairman, what we'd done with chairman's TAC while he was away being confirmed, and then pointing forward and where we were going. And at the very end of the meeting, he said, do you think we should remove that acting title? And I said something like, mumble, okay, maybe. And he said, great, reached over, grabbed my hand, congratulations, sucker. Certainly will be a very memorable part of my experience.
Well, now we know who the next FCC
chair is. Oh, dear. Okay. So onward, just a couple of items. We do have some do betters for this year, and with the support of the chairman. One is to get an earlier start on the tasks for the coming year. So we will be diligently working, and Walter's already introduced the notion that we would have a conference call to try to get this instantiated. The chairman is already involved. We did review some of the topics that you've already seen from Walter's handout, or hopefully have seen, as a starter list, and he had some comments and inputs on that list, the list actually that existed before this list, so it has already had an initial vetting. But we are still soliciting your input, and do now solicit your input for topics for the coming year, and we'll have a call to talk about that. But the goal is that we would get the topics instantiated by the middle of January, send out a request for your input on the working groups that you'd like to participate in, and particularly those of you who would like to serve as chairs of those groups, Usually that's not a large group clamoring for the opportunity, but nonetheless, we'll hope springs eternal on that opportunity.
Well, you will be volunteered.
Yeah, we will have chairs, however, for each of the groups. So if you have a preferred group that you'd like to chair, that would be a good thing for you to do. But the goal is to be up and running by the end of January. Last year, we really didn't get up and running until our March meeting, so the goal is that we would be up and running so that in March we would be able to review progress that had been already made by the working groups. I would like to just add my thanks to each of you and welcome to Paul as our newest member, and welcome again and thank you for those of you who are sitting in for others who are nonetheless new to this group, and we appreciate the active participation. We'll look forward to great things from you, Paul. Really do want to thank in particular the working group chairs for their service, the active working group members, and we've certainly seen evidence of a lot of work. It's just amazing to me, not only the 10 workshop proposals, but more so the 5 papers that you have all said that are coming in over the course of the next month, and all of the work. It's really an extremely in-depth amount of consideration that you've taken, and I know that it is valuable to the FCC, and so that's terrific. I would like to call out and recognize the FCC staff contacts to each of those working groups as well. Sometimes they're the unsung heroes for the working groups that keep things going, and while we take a lot of the credit as TAC members, there's a tremendous amount of work, and in this case, would the contact members stand up? Unusual, but have you stand up? Stand up. Stand up. And a round of applause. And last, I just want to thank Walter, particularly for this one with help from Michael as well, going through the new system and having the network go down right in the middle of resiliency. That was, so well executed to have that happen at exactly that time. So do appreciate it.
All future material will be delivered by drone.
No, we're not delivering by drone. But thank you one and all. Have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.